Chapter 3186. Just as the hearts of all the transcendents in the world were trembling. In another place, there were also some existences who were extremely shaken. That place was not outside the endless world, nor was it in a place that was between the endless world and the endless world. Instead, it was in another place that was even more mysterious and unimaginable. That place seemed to be within the paths, but also seemed to be outside the paths. It seemed to exist, but also seemed to be an illusion. There were millions of such places in the world created by the endless world tribulations. Moreover, these millions of places seemed to have a rather subtle connection between them, causing them to faintly feel like they were one. It was just like the relationship between the endless heaven and earth and the endless heaven and earth. Strictly speaking, the boundless heavens and earth were not considered as a true entity within the boundless heavens and earth. Among them, each world had its own organization. Every world belonged to a branch of a certain island. The only ones that were directly connected to those worlds were the ones within the branches of the island, the ones in the upper or lower layers of the world. It was only because of the emergence of the transcendent that a relatively tight connection was established between the worlds. That was why the countless worlds seemed to form a single entity from a certain point of view, and the birth of the endless heaven and earth as a whole. Now, these strange places that were between reality and illusion, between the inside and outside of the paths, were similar to the many worlds in the endless world. From an intuitive point of view, there was no real connection between these places. However, due to the influence of the endless world tribulations and the subtle connection between the paths, these places seemed to form a whole from a certain point of view. It was like the essence of the endless world. At this time, there was clearly only one kind of existence that existed in these places. That was the many fifth tribulation experts that had been sent away by the endless world tribulations. In other words, they were the source of the many paths. At this moment, the state that these fifth tribulation experts were in was rather subtle. They seemed to exist, but also seemed not to exist. As for the endless, terrifying power that could instantly suck out millions of worlds, there was no longer any of it left in their bodies. Now, all that was left of them was their consciousness and will. Furthermore, the various mysterious powers that these consciousnesses and wills carried had been completely eliminated, and they could not be displayed at all. In other words, they could only sense, but they couldn't change anything. At least, they hadn't found a way to change anything. At that moment, among the millions of special places, there was one place that was the most special. That was because the fifth tribulation experts in the other places were still conscious, but the existence in that place didn't even have a clear consciousness. Surprisingly, he was sleeping in a strange place that belonged to him alone. And that place was none other than the miraculous place corresponding to the path that was born in the end. In other words, it corresponds to the path that you, a fourth tribulation expert with limitless potential, comprehended at the last moment of your defeat. From this, one could naturally tell who was sleeping in this special place. Apart from that fourth tribulation expert with limitless potential, there was no one else. And the reason why this fourth tribulation expert was sleeping was not because he was too weak. In fact, in this special place, power and realm were all meaningless. All existences were at the same level and in the same state. Under such circumstances, no matter what realm they were originally at, there would be no difference in their essence. Naturally, it was impossible for his performance to be different just because everyone else was a fifth tribulation expert, and he was a fourth tribulation expert. In fact, the real reason why he was sleeping was because he carried many things that the other fifth tribulation experts didn't carry. That was the last hope of the world that he corresponded to. At that moment, in that extremely special place, the fourth tribulation expert was curled up as if he was in his mother's womb. Between his chest and abdomen, there was a small illusory world lying there quietly, as if it had been solidified. In that part of the world, one could see everything that a normal world would have. One could even see billions and trillions of living beings densely packed together. This illusory world was not the main body of the world that was born from his transcendence. Instead, it was the hidden consciousness of all living beings in that world. Compared to other places, the transcendents in this endless world had a deeper understanding of the existence of the hidden consciousness. After all, they relied on their own hidden consciousness to forcibly squeeze the Creator's authority in this endless world to second place. This great achievement was enough for them to take the hidden consciousness seriously. And for these tribulation experts, as long as they took it seriously, they would naturally have a deeper understanding of it. With enough time, they would naturally have an extremely deep understanding of it. And they could even use it to do countless things that other existences couldn't. It could be said that apart from the transcendence, the greatest characteristic of the endless world was the efficiency with which they used the hidden consciousness. Because they had a deep understanding of the hidden consciousness, the transcendents in this endless world could discover many possibilities that other cultivators couldn't, such as the possibility of the hidden consciousness. For example, the hidden consciousness of all living beings in this world. This was something that ordinary cultivators didn't really care about, but the transcendents paid great attention to. There was naturally a fundamental difference between the hidden consciousness of all living beings and the sum of the independent consciousness of all living beings. The sum of the independent consciousness of all living beings was the gathering of the consciousness of all living beings. On the other hand, the hidden consciousness of all living beings was the interweaving and superimposing of the consciousness of all living beings. In other words, it was a rather large body. In terms of function, preserving the sum of the independent consciousness of all living beings was equivalent to preserving all living beings. As long as the conditions were right, they could reconstruct their bodies and all living beings would be completely resurrected. However, the hidden consciousness of all living beings was completely different. Even if the hidden consciousness of all living beings was preserved, in the end, it would only be a strand of consciousness. Perhaps it had other wonderful uses, but the possibility of resurrecting all living beings with the hidden consciousness of all living beings was minuscule. At the very least, it was impossible for it to be like before, where just reconstructing their bodies was enough. If this fourth tribulation powerhouse truly had the ability to protect all living beings in the world he cared about, he would naturally have to preserve the sum of the independent consciousness of all living beings. However, it was clear that the number of living beings in a world that had developed for countless trillions of years had surpassed the limits of an ordinary living being's imagination. Even a fourth tribulation powerhouse would find it impossible to completely bear the consciousness of so many living beings. After all, this fourth tribulation powerhouse only had this bit of consciousness left. He didn't have any power or power at all. Compared to this, although the hidden consciousness of all living beings was extremely great, it was still just a strand of consciousness. As long as one knew the method to bear this consciousness, there were still many techniques that could be used to bear it. However, this was not as difficult as bearing the sum of the independent consciousnesses, where each consciousness had to forcefully bear it. It was clear that as a fourth tribulation powerhouse with limitless potential, he naturally knew the method. As such, in the end, he was still able to bear the pressure of the hidden consciousness of all living beings. However, the hidden consciousness of all living beings was still too huge, and the pressure was simply too great. That was why this fourth tribulation powerhouse, with limitless potential, had no choice but to choose to sleep to bear the pressure. That was why this situation had occurred. Even though their essence was clearly the same in this strange place, the other fifth tribulation powerhouses were still safe and sound, while the fourth tribulation powerhouse could only fall into a deep sleep. As for why this fourth tribulation powerhouse with limitless potential had to do this, the reason was very simple. Although the hidden consciousness of all living beings wasn't an independent consciousness of all living beings, it couldn't directly reconstruct the body to revive all living beings. However, this was his last hope to protect all living beings. After all, although the hidden consciousness couldn't revive all living beings by reconstructing the body, it didn't mean that there was no other way to revive them. After all, the hidden consciousness came from all living beings, and it contained the essence of all living beings. It wasn't impossible that he couldn't think of a way. It was just that he hadn't thought of it yet. As a fourth tribulation powerhouse with limitless potential, his determination was self-evident. Although he didn't think that his talent was that extraordinary, and his potential was that incredible. However, he had a firm conviction to carry out his own will and his own beliefs. And now, to him, his greatest belief and thought was to borrow this hidden consciousness to bring all living beings back to life. No matter how much energy and time this process would take. Even if he couldn't make any progress in the future, even if he had to spend billions of years, he wouldn't hesitate. It was precisely because of this that he firmly protected the hidden consciousness of all living beings. Even if he had to fall into a deep sleep and couldn't take the initiative to fight for that tiny bit of hope, it was the same for the endless tribulations of the world that gave them a chance to live. This fourth tribulation powerhouse's deep sleep had lasted for several years. After all, it had been several years since the fourth tribulation powerhouse with limitless potential formed his own path. Although this had happened tens of millions of years ago in the secret realm, it was only a few years compared to the outside world. Clearly, these paths were formed by the endless world in this world, so the flow of time was naturally the same as the flow of time in this world. As a result, even though tens of millions of years had passed in the secret realm, it was only a few years in this strange place. After several years, the other fifth tribulation powerhouses had long been shocked by what they saw. Naturally, this wasn't what stirred their hearts at the moment. In fact, the emotions of the fifth tribulation powerhouses were stirred because of the continuous sacrifices of the fourth tribulation powerhouses. They had never thought that the fourth tribulation experts they had looked down upon would face the endless tribulation of the world in such a way. As fifth tribulation powerhouses, if they were in their position, they wouldn't have the courage to make the same decision and sacrifice themselves with them. In the eyes of the fourth tribulation powerhouses who sacrificed themselves, this kind of sacrifice only happened once in hundreds of thousands of years, or even once in millions of years. However, in the eyes of the fifth tribulation powerhouses and the transcendents outside the secret realm, this kind of sacrifice happened once every few days. The feeling of a sacrifice that happened once in hundreds of thousands of years and a sacrifice that happened once every few days was naturally completely different. Although the sacrifice that happened once every few 100,000 years was quite shocking, it was too long after all, so the degree of shock from the sacrifice was greatly reduced. In comparison, the feeling of a sacrifice that happened once every few days was obviously completely different. This kind of intensive sacrifice would naturally form an atmosphere that couldn't be sacrificed, an atmosphere that could shake people's hearts. At this moment, the fifth tribulation powerhouses were clearly shocked. It was just like the transcendents outside the secret realm. They were also shocked. I didn't expect them to do this. I suddenly feel that our chances of survival are quite high. A fifth tribulation powerhouse sighed, as if he had just regained his senses. Another female fifth tribulation powerhouse suddenly said, emotionally, "I never realized that the endless world was so beautiful." Her words resonated with many other fifth tribulation powerhouses, causing their faces to show an indescribable radiance. Chapter 31:88. However, no matter how small the chance was, it was still a chance. As long as it wasn't completely hopeless, it was a reason to fight, and it was the motivation to continue. The endless heaven and earth tribulations left these fifth tribulation experts with a chance of survival. When the last tribulation was over, the last traces left on their path would be their own. In other words, if one's path reached a certain realm, then it didn't matter who contributed to the countless realms before that realm. But as long as the fifth tribulation expert was the one who pushed the continent into that realm, then he would be able to seize this chance. Naturally, he would be able to avoid being harmed by the endless heaven and earth tribulations. for this fifth tribulation expert, who had already been walked on his path by a sixth tribulation expert, it meant that his path would once again be improved upon the perfect foundation of a sixth tribulation expert. In other words, he would be able to take a small step forward on his path. No matter how small the step was, as long as he could push forward on this path, then he would be able to seize that little chance of survival. Of course, even if it was just to achieve this, to achieve the goal of taking a small step forward on this path, the difficulty had already reached a level that would make ordinary fifth tribulation experts despair. It wasn't that it was difficult to take a small step forward on top of the peak. Rather, it was that the difficulty of reaching that peak was so high that it would make ordinary fifth tribulation experts despair. Taking another small step forward on the complete foundation from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation. Its nature was equivalent to increasing the height of a pillar that could hold up the heavens by one level. However, there were two ways to increase the height of a pillar that could support the heavens by another level. The first way was to climb to the top of the pillar and then use the same material as the pillar to create a small section of the pillar. The second way was to directly put the pillar down and then use the same material at the bottom of the pillar to create a small section of the pillar. Then, the pillar would be erected again. It was the same for this path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation. If one wanted to take a step forward on this path, above the sixth tribulation, they would have to walk to the end of the path, completely walk through the entire path, and then move forward. Or they would have to overthrow this path and create another layer of space for this path to improve from the foundation. Obviously, no matter which method it was, the difficulty was extremely shocking. Moreover, compared to the first method, the second method, which was to topple the path and then build it up again, was thousands of times more difficult. After all, this was the path from 5 to 6 tribulations. It would be extremely difficult to overthrow such a path, not to mention to add another layer on top of it. After that, they would have to rebuild it. It could be said that these two steps were not any easier than walking through this path. Therefore, there was no need to say anything more about how he should choose. For a fifth tribulation expert, there was only one choice. That was to first walk this path, walk to the end of the path, walk to the peak of the path, and then take a step further from this peak. What did it mean to walk the path between the fifth and sixth tribulations? That meant that the fifth tribulation expert had completed a qualitative improvement. He had ascended from a fifth tribulation expert to a sixth tribulation expert. From this perspective, one would know how difficult it was to walk this path to the end. Under normal circumstances, even if a fifth tribulation expert had endless opportunities, even if he had endless time, the possibility of successfully breaking through is only 1 in 1,000. In fact, in the tribulation realm, the probability of breaking through each realm was almost the same. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a situation where the number of cultivators would decrease greatly with every increase in realm. If one had the right opportunity and enough time, they would definitely be able to break through. Then, in the tribulation realm, the difference in the number of cultivators in each realm would not be too big. Even if it was impossible for it to be exactly the same, it should be on the same order of magnitude. Obviously, this was not the case. Therefore, even if a fifth tribulation expert only walked this path, the probability was actually only 1 in 1,000. However, in comparison, if he could really walk this path, it would be much easier for him to take a step further from the peak. After all, taking a step forward didn't necessarily have to be the absolute right step. It was as if a fifth tribulation expert had already opened up an imperfect path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation before he was brought into his current state by the endless tribulations of the world. That path itself was actually extremely imperfect. It could even be said to be a path with great mistakes. However, that path was also recognized by the endless tribulations of the world. It became a path to test them and other transcendence. If such a path could become a path, then standing at the peak and exploring in the direction one wanted, no matter which direction, whether it was the right direction or the wrong direction, or even the most absurd direction, it was all an extension of this path, and it was all a sublimation of this path. This was also because those 6 tribulation experts weren't interested in this path, which was why they could have such convenience. Otherwise, if the six tribulation experts casually took a step forward when they reached the requirements of the endless tribulations of the world, it would be true despair for the fifth tribulation experts. A casual step by a sixth tribulation expert was equivalent to confirming that the path itself had been sublimated to the sixth tribulation to the seventh tribulation. Even if he had just stepped into that level, it meant that if he wanted to sublimate that path, he would need to have a considerable achievement in the sixth tribulation level of cultivation. At the very least, he had to completely stabilize the sixth tribulation level of cultivation, and obviously for a fifth tribulation expert, just stepping into that level was extremely difficult. He still needed to stabilize that level and completely digest all the foundation that that level represented. After that, he also needed to have an extremely deep understanding of that level, and finally be able to continue to improve. The difficulty of sublimation was self-evident. It could be said that it would reduce the success rate of a fifth tribulation expert to 1 in 1,000 in an instant. However, if you do that and they choose your path, I'm afraid they will be very unlucky. At this moment, a fifth tribulation expert suddenly said. It was the fifth tribulation expert who had gathered his fighting spirit and was trying his best to grasp the last bit of hope. His expression froze slightly. He didn't think too much before. He was just trying his best to search for the last bit of hope, and he didn't consider anything else. Now that he was reminded, he suddenly realized what the result would be if he really did what he had expected. At that time, would the path that he had extracted from the endless heaven and earth tribulations be sublimated along with his sublimation of that path? If it was sublimated, then the result would be quite terrible for those who had transcended. There were countless paths to take after reaching the peak. There could be innumerable correct directions among them. Under such circumstances, even if he carefully chose a path that was most likely to be correct for the other transcendents, it would only be reducing the original countless possibilities to a slightly smaller number of possibilities. Under such circumstances, the possibility of them being able to completely fit this path and completely walk this path would obviously be greatly reduced. Perhaps among thousands of people, there would be one who was extremely lucky and just happened to fit the path that he had extended to take a step forward. In that case, apart from that 1 in 1,000, what would be the fate of everyone else? Of course, it would be complete failure, and they would be directly devoured by the tribulation. Thinking of this possibility, the fifth tribulation expert couldn't help but feel extremely conflicted. One of the fifth tribulation experts sighed and said, "So it's like this. I originally thought that we wouldn't be in a direct confrontation with them. I didn't expect that we would still be enemies in the end. It's just that we've changed the method." His words, however, made the other fifth tribulation experts feel a sense of sorrow. But they had all figured out the dilemma that the fifth tribulation expert was in. If they were in the fifth tribulation expert's position, they would also feel troubled. As fifth tribulation experts, they naturally wouldn't be willing to give up their lives so easily. However, for the sake of their own lives, they had to watch as countless transcendents fell into a pit and died because of them. This kind of thing was very stressful for them. In other words, unless they had no other choice, they definitely wouldn't be willing to do it. But now, the reality was that they could either choose themselves, or they would be digging an abyss for those transcendents and watch as they fell into it. Or they could choose to sacrifice themselves and help those transcendents. One could imagine how conflicted they were about this. The fifth tribulation expert was conflicted for a long time before sighing and saying, "Then leave it to fate. If there's a chance to sublimate the path, I will keep it until the end. I will keep it until almost everyone has walked the path before trying again." Based on the sixth tribulation expert's performance after walking the path, once the transcendents successfully walked the path, they would be able to escape this wave of tribulations and completely disappear from this world. This way, no matter what happens on the path, it wouldn't affect them at all. In this way, there was a possibility that his dilemma could be resolved. As long as the majority of the transcendents successfully walked the path and escaped this wave of tribulations, he would be able to sublimate his own path after leaving this world, allowing his path to reach the peak. Then, he would be able to have the best of both worlds. Of course, it was only almost. After all, if all the transcendents escaped this wave of tribulations, the result would be obvious. At that time, if he didn't complete the sublimation of his path and didn't reach the peak, it would mean that he didn't grasp the last chance of survival left to him by the endless tribulations. It would mean that he would be completely devoured and destroyed by this wave of tribulations. In other words, in the end, unless he was willing to sacrifice himself, there would still be some transcendents who would fall behind him. In this case, the only hope for those transcendents who fell behind him was that they were lucky enough to coincide with the new path opened by the fifth tribulation expert. Only then would they have a chance to continue surviving. And it was clear that the probability of that happening was very small. It had already been proven. The fifth tribulation expert was well aware of this. However, he didn't feel conflicted at this time. He wasn't willing to let the other transcendents fall into a hopeless situation of death and fall into a boundless abyss for his own benefit. However, this didn't mean that he was a moral saint. Naturally, he wasn't willing to cut off the hope of countless transcendents just for himself. However, he wouldn't feel the slightest bit of mercy if a few transcendents died for his own sake. Therefore, in the end, after most of the transcending experts had escaped, he would definitely not compete with the remaining transcending experts and compete with them for speed. The expressions of the other fifth tribulation experts changed slightly when they heard his words. Soon, they also revealed expressions of relief. Clearly, they had already figured out what the fifth tribulation expert was thinking. That's one way, too, they all thought. As for the fifth tribulation expert pushing forward at the last moment, it would be a huge disaster for the remaining transcendents. However, they didn't care about it all. In the end, the fifth tribulation experts were still cultivators. As cultivators, competing with others for the sake of their own cultivation was practically an instinct. Those transcendents who had fallen to the very end were not pushed to the very end by them, but by themselves. And since they were the last ones, they naturally had to bear the consequences of falling behind. As a result, it was natural for them to bear more dangers and greater risks. The fifth tribulation experts who were already ahead of them didn't have any reason to bear more risks for them. As they thought through all of this, the atmosphere in the millions of strange places became much more relaxed. However, no matter how relaxed they were, compared to the beginning, they were still much more nervous. After all, it wasn't just the fifth tribulation experts who had chosen the path to break through that was in danger, but all the fifth tribulation experts were facing similar risks. Chapter 3189. Although it seemed that only the path of the fifth tribulation expert had been changed by the sixth tribulation expert, the paths of the others did not attract the sixth tribulation expert's interest. However, it was obvious that this was only temporary. The sixth tribulation expert's interest was something extremely unreliable. Just because they were not interested now did not mean that they would not be interested in the future. As long as the sixth tribulation expert was interested in the path of any fifth tribulation expert, then they would definitely fall into the same situation as the fifth tribulation expert. It could be said that at this moment, all the fifth tribulation experts knew that there was a sharp blade hanging above their heads that could easily pierce through them. Under such circumstances, how could they be completely at ease? How could the atmosphere between the fifth tribulation experts remain the same? At this moment, whether it was between the fifth tribulation experts or the transcending experts, the atmosphere was extremely tense. This was actually not something to be surprised about. After all, they were in the midst of the endless tribulations. Under such circumstances, it was normal to be nervous, irritated, and even fearful. On the contrary, it was abnormal to be relaxed, carefree, and joyful. Time passed bit by bit. More and more fourth tribulation experts tried again and again in the world created by the endless tribulation of the heavens and earth. In the end, after hundreds of millions of years, a fourth tribulation cultivator finally succeeded in one of the two paths. The path that he walked through was not the path that the fourth tribulation expert with limitless potential had in the end. Instead, it was the path that everyone had discussed before, the path that could bring about the greatest change. The moment the path was cleared, the fourth tribulation expert who had cleared the path suddenly underwent a change that the other four tribulation experts could not have imagined. His aura began to expand like a balloon. Boundless power and boundless might began to appear within his body out of thin air. The various restrictions that the endless tribulations had placed on his body seemed to have been completely released at this moment, completely disappearing. Apart from that, the fourth tribulation cultivator also felt that his cultivation level did not stop growing after he reached his original peak. Instead, it seemed to be climbing crazily without a limit. Very soon, he reached the fifth tribulation cultivator. Then he started to walk towards the end of the path he had been walking on. It worked. An inexplicable emotion appeared in the heart of the fourth tribulation expert, or rather, the fifth tribulation expert. The feeling of endless improvement was so wonderful that even a fifth tribulation powerhouse who had just become a fifth tribulation powerhouse found it hard to resist. He felt like he was going to be immersed in this wonderful feeling. However, he soon realized that something was amiss. Although this kind of improvement was so fast and felt so perfect, he could faintly feel a subtle distortion acting on him, acting on his own path of cultivation. Under the effect of this distortion, his body and mind, as well as his path of cultivation, were all subtly deviating. This deviation was not a complete deviation, but only a part of it. If compared to an ordinary path, this deviation was like opening up a third path between two originally parallel paths. His original path and the path he had taken before were joined together, forming two parallel paths. At this moment, his own path was obviously affected by the path that he had just taken and was deviating towards the path that he had just taken. However, it was clear that the force of a shift was not strong enough. Although it had already distorted his path and caused his path to deviate. However, it did not really deviate to the new path that had already been taken. In this way, it was equivalent to opening up another path between these two paths. It did not belong to his original path, nor did it belong to the path that had already been taken. Such a state was simply the worst possible outcome for a new fifth tribulation expert. If the path did not deviate, then he would naturally be able to adjust his own path bit by bit based on his previous experience, absorb the nutrients that he had previously come into contact with, and slowly expand his own path in the right direction. In the end, it was naturally impossible to say that he would definitely be able to reach a certain height. However, at the very least, he would be able to follow the same path as his original path and reach an extremely high level. And if this deviation was a little stronger, it would directly deviate his original path to the path that he had just taken. Although that would be a complete change to his own path, it was still a change that could be accepted by most people. After all, it was a change that could be accepted by most people from an unknown path. After all, he had shifted from a path with an unknown future to a powerful path that could even lead him to become a sixth tribulation cultivator. Such an outcome was also acceptable to most cultivators. It could be said that if the situation was like this fifth tribulation cultivator would probably wake up from his dreams laughing. However, it was a pity that the current path wasn't like this at all. Now, this fifth tribulation cultivator's path could not maintain its original trajectory. It could not allow him to follow his original path bit by bit towards the right direction, and it could not continue all of his past cultivation foundation. Similarly, he could not step onto the path that he had just taken, the path that he clearly knew would allow him to step into the sixth tribulation realm. It could be said that he was in an extremely awkward state, neither up nor down. This situation could be said to be the worst situation for this fifth tribulation cultivator. Facing such a situation, how could this newly ascended fifth tribulation cultivator not change his expression? On this awkward path, this newly ascended fifth tribulation cultivator's speed of improvement became slower and slower. In the end, it completely stopped at a certain level. However, it did not allow him to directly become a sixth tribulation cultivator like what he had experienced before. As his ascension truly came to a halt, a brand new path appeared out of thin air in this world. And this fifth tribulation cultivator's figure gradually became illusory. In the end, he completely disappeared in front of the many transcending experts and directly appeared in the seemingly endless void where the other fifth tribulation cultivators were. This fifth tribulation cultivator looked at the millions of fifth tribulation cultivators around him that he was rather familiar with. His expression became indescribably complicated. So, we made such a huge sacrifice, but in the end, we only added one more path to the test. This fifth tribulation cultivator sighed. No, it's not that we added one more path to the test. Instead, it's that we have one more fellow cultivator waiting for luck to arrive. A fifth tribulation cultivator said indifferently. The newly ascended fifth tribulation cultivator carefully sensed his situation and immediately understood his situation. For a moment, cold sweat dripped down his back. He inexplicably felt a lingering fear in his heart. Fortunately, in the end, he walked the path that he had already walked once. If he walked another path opened by a fourth tribulation cultivator with limitless potential, then wouldn't it be a disaster for the fourth tribulation cultivator who is currently in deep sleep? It should be known that for the many cultivators on this path, the only chance of survival was whether or not they could maintain the last trace of the path. If they could, then they would be able to grasp the last bit of survival. After this wave of tribulations, they would naturally be able to escape and regain their freedom. However, if this wasn't the case, then what awaited them was the endless tribulation of the world, never to be reincarnated. The other fifth tribulation cultivators were fine, as they were still clear-headed. Although it would be a great disaster for them if their path was taken by someone else, since they were still clear-headed, they naturally had a chance to make up for it. In comparison, the fourth tribulation cultivator with limitless potential was clearly different. This was because in order to bear the burden of the entire hidden consciousness of all living beings in the world, he had fallen into the deepest state of sleep. In this state, he could only say that he was still alive. As for anything that happened in the outside world, it was clear that he could no longer react. In this case, if someone's achievements on the path opened up by him surpassed him, then there was no way for him to make up for it. In other words, if someone walked the path opened up by him, then it was clearly equivalent to directly killing him. As an existence that admired and felt gratitude towards this fourth tribulation cultivator with limitless potential, if one's actions from a certain point of view directly pushed him into the abyss of death, this was something that even a fifth tribulation cultivator would find very hard to accept. Fortunately, things didn't develop to that point. In these years, although many people chose to try the path opened up by the fourth tribulation cultivator with limitless potential, even those who were closest to the end had only walked close to 98% of the path. This kind of progress, however, could not be compared to the fourth tribulation cultivator with limitless potential. After all, back then, the fourth tribulation cultivator had walked 99% of the path and was almost able to directly connect it. This could be considered a blessing in misfortune. And as he walked the path that could allow him to make the greatest changes, the risk of the fourth tribulation cultivator with limitless potential was greatly reduced. Even if the fourth tribulation cultivator with limitless potential could already walk 99% of the path opened up by him, it was still only 99% in the end. After all, there was still an intrinsic difference between completely connecting the path and connecting it. It was like an exam. If you could get 99 points, that was because your ability could only get 99 points. And if someone could get 100 points, that was because the exam paper only had 100 points. This was the intrinsic difference between 99 points and 100 points. Similarly, it was the same when it came to the path opened up by the fourth tribulation cultivator with limitless potential. The fourth tribulation cultivator with limitless potential had already walked 99% of the path opened up by him and only needed one last step to completely connect it. However, no one could be sure if it was really just one step short or if this was the limit of the path. If there was no other way, the fourth tribulation cultivators naturally wouldn't reject this path. After all, other paths had not been proven to be much better than this one. But it was clear that there was no other way at this time. At this time, there was already a path that had been proven to be possible. Even the method to go through it had been explained in detail. Under such circumstances, there was no need to say anything about the choice. Although these fourth tribulation cultivators had made up their minds to sacrifice themselves to pave the path for the countless transcendents in the endless world, it didn't mean that they didn't care about their own lives at all. They had made up their minds to sacrifice themselves because if they didn't do so, no one would be able to survive. That was because for the endless world to continue to exist, people needed to be sacrificed. In fact, being willing to make such a sacrifice, from another point of view, showed that their love for life was far more intense than that of the other transcendents. Only extreme passion could give them the motivation to sacrifice themselves and create an opportunity for the endless world to continue to exist. Under such circumstances, faced with the possibility of survival, how could they not seize it? Therefore, between a path that could be taken with 100% certainty and a path that could only be taken with 99% certainty, it wasn't a problem at all for these fourth tribulation cultivators to choose. His behavior seems to be different. At this time, the fourth tribulation cultivators were engaged in an intense discussion. The target of their discussion was naturally the fourth tribulation expert, or rather, the current fifth tribulation expert, who had walked through the path and then completely disappeared from the boundless world that all of them could sense. For the four tribulation cultivators, they weren't in a competitive relationship at this time, but a cooperative relationship. Even if they had chosen this path before, that was the result of their discussion. Under such circumstances, when encountering a difficult problem or abnormal change, they naturally wouldn't give up on discussing with each other. This was the fastest way to find out the truth. He has become a fifth tribulation cultivator. Very soon, they came to a conclusion. Compared to the previous six tribulation cultivators, the fourth tribulation cultivator had undergone a transformation after taking the path. He had become a fifth tribulation cultivator. Clearly, it was precisely because of this, and also because he had become a fifth tribulation powerhouse after clearing the path, that his body had undergone some changes that were different from the others. Chapter 3190. Now, apart from the previous fourth tribulation expert and the current fifth tribulation expert, the rest who had taken the path were all six tribulation experts. Compared to the fifth tribulation experts, the six tribulation experts left this world and returned to the boundless world after they had completed the path. The entire process was so natural and casual. It was as if they had just gone out and then returned. It was because of their behavior that the four tribulation experts had all sorts of wrong impressions about what would happen if they took the path. Although the fourth tribulation expert with boundless potential behaved differently from the six tribulation experts, he did not take the path after all. In essence, he was already different from the six tribulation experts. Under such circumstances, it was not surprising that he behaved differently from the six tribulation experts. The four tribulation experts naturally would not think too much just because of the difference in him. In comparison, the fifth tribulation expert who had just taken the path was completely different. His situation was no different from that of the six tribulation experts. However, the changes that happened to him after taking the path were fundamentally different from the changes that happened to the six tribulation experts after taking the path. How could they not think deeply about this? Once they thought deeply about it, their previous misconceptions would naturally be revealed. Perhaps this kind of change is normal. The behavior of the six tribulation experts is actually abnormal. A fourth tribulation expert said, with a complicated expression. The other fourth tribulation experts had similar expressions on their faces. They were also not calm. In reality, no matter what, these fourth tribulation experts had surpassed one peak after another and crossed one huge obstacle after another. For people like them, even if they weren't known for their intelligence was definitely many times greater than that of ordinary cultivators. If there was no obvious comparison, it might be difficult for them to notice the key point. However, when the obvious comparison was revealed in front of them, it was impossible for them not to notice the key point no matter what. No matter how imperfect those paths were, no matter how complicated they were still the path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation. Such a path must have been extended from the path before the five tribulations as the foundation. In other words, no matter how many twists and turns, how imperfect, how many omissions, or even how many mistakes there were, the paths shown before the 5 tribulations were all correct and complete enough for any cultivator to become a 5 tribulation cultivator. After they had chosen their path, the endless heaven and earth tribulations allowed them to stand at the beginning of the path, giving them the right to advance along the path. What did this mean? This meant that after they had chosen their path, they had actually already obtained the essence that they had obtained before the 5 tribulations by completely following the correct path. Even though they weren't complete 5th tribulation cultivators at that time, and there was a world of difference between them in terms of power, strength, and divine sense, they were still essentially the same. This essence, which was similar to that of a 5th tribulation expert, was clearly an indescribable sublimation compared to their original essence. Under such circumstances, if they were in such a state for a long enough time, they would naturally be affected by this sublimation. Their own essence would also slowly improve, and if there was an opportunity in the future, they might be able to sublimate and become a 5th tribulation cultivator. Obviously, walking the path from the 5th tribulation to the 6th tribulation was the greatest opportunity. In this way, it was actually very natural for a 4th tribulation cultivator to have such a change at this time. After understanding this, the expressions of the 4th tribulation cultivators became even more complicated. This clearly proved one point, and that was that what the 4th tribulation cultivator was experiencing right now was very likely what all of them would experience. In other words, if these 4th tribulation cultivators walked the correct path, there was a high chance that they would also fall into the same fate as the 4th tribulation cultivator. They would also become 5th tribulation cultivators, and similarly, a new path would be born in this world. Perhaps only those who hadn't reached the 4th tribulation cultivator could avoid such an ending because their level was too low, and the gap between them and 5th tribulation cultivators was too great. Suddenly, a 4th tribulation cultivator murmured, "I keep feeling that this new path is a little different from his original path." After he said this, the secret realm went silent. It wasn't that they were overreacting, but this matter was too important. It should be known that the fate of the 4th tribulation cultivator was very likely to be the fate of all of them. Under such circumstances, the abnormalities of any 4th tribulation cultivator, or rather, the current 5th tribulation cultivator, were very likely to happen to them. Under such circumstances, how could they not care about things related to it? How could they ignore the signs of an accident discovered by any powerhouse? "Are you sure?" asked a 4th tribulation cultivator. The expression of the 4th tribulation cultivator became extremely serious. He nodded and said, "That's right. I'm very sure that this new path is definitely very different from his original path." When the other 4th tribulation cultivators heard this, their expressions all became serious. They didn't doubt the judgment of the 4th tribulation cultivator. After staying here for such a long time, they were already quite familiar with each other. Even though there were a lot of 4th tribulation cultivators here, it didn't affect this familiarity. After all, they had been here for hundreds of millions of years. As for who had a closer relationship with whom, they were all very clear about it. The 4th tribulation cultivator who was murmuring and the 4th tribulation cultivator who had just completed his path were publicly acknowledged. If there was only one expert in this secret realm who could identify the difference between the 4th tribulation cultivator's path, that person would definitely be him. Under such circumstances, if he said that the path was different, then the path was definitely different. Is this another test of the 4th tribulation cultivator? At this moment, many 4th tribulation cultivators had the same thought. Previously, these 4th tribulation cultivators didn't have to worry about it. They naturally knew what the difference in the path represented. In fact, although the path of cultivation and the path of Tao were often mentioned together, there was actually a subtle difference between the two. The path represented the way to move from one realm to another. For example, from a quasi-sage to a false sage, one had to go through 5 corresponding realms: initial stage, intermediate stage, great stage, and peak stage. What kind of requirements did one have to meet in order to break through each realm? What kind of miracle did one have to meet in order to break through each realm? Another example was that from a false sage to a false sage, One had to go through 9 stages. What kind of characteristics did each stage have? What kind of requirements did one have to meet? And what kind of opportunities did one have to meet in order to achieve and even break through the stages and nodes that one had to go through in order to improve one's realm? The various requirements that one had to meet and the various opportunities that one had to meet were the paths. If one were to compare them with mortal things, the 2 realms were like 2 points with a certain distance between them. And the path was the intermediate path that one had to cross from one point to another. This was also the origin of the name of the path. In contrast, the path of Tao of cultivation was what cultivators relied on across between these 2 points, and it was also the method that they used. From a certain point of view, there wasn't much difference between the 2. It was precisely because of this that one could equate the 2 when talking about them. The path of Tao of cultivation was directly regarded as a certain specific form in the path of crossing certain realms. However, it was obvious that if one really looked into it, the 2 were completely different. Using an abstract comparison, the difference between the 2 seemed rather vague. However, if one were to use the path of Tao of mortals as an analogy, the difference was very obvious. The path existed naturally, and it was the intermediate path that connected 2 points. And the path of Tao of cultivation was the method that the cultivator used through this path. The difference between the 2 was huge. From this perspective, it was obvious that the difference was huge. One was something that existed naturally, while the other was just a method. After such a change, the difference between the path of Tao of cultivation of different cultivators was already very obvious. The same path was obviously crossed by different people in completely different ways. Some people walked over, some people ran over, some people flew over, some people danced over, and some weirdos even crawled over. Different people had different choices, but in the end, they all passed through the same path. They all crossed the path between 2 points, and from one point to another, they all followed the same path. And this was the fundamental reason why the path of Tao of cultivation was completely different for different cultivators, even though the path of Tao of cultivation was the same. And now, the paths that appeared in this world and could be chosen by many transcending experts were the true paths, and not the path of Tao of cultivation of some cultivators. Even if they were created by the 5th tribulation cultivators, it was still the same. After all, the 5th tribulation cultivators created these paths in order to open a path from the 5th tribulation to the 6th tribulation. Different Tao paths opened up by different 5th tribulation experts were like paths opened up by them between 2 points with different trajectories. Looking at the current situation, some of these paths were extremely twisted, some were cut off halfway, and some even suddenly shrunk to the point where it was difficult for people to pass through, and so on and so forth. There are all sorts of flaws in these paths, and what the 4th tribulation cultivators had to do was to choose a path that was the closest to the true straight path and then walk through it. But obviously, the 5th tribulation cultivators had their own path of cultivation. Using the path of mortals as an analogy, they had their own way of traveling, and different ways of traveling meant different obstacles, and the difficulty of passing through was obviously different. This difference in difficulty would obviously lead to different choices when opening up a path. For example, those who traveled by flying would naturally not pay much attention to the differences in the terrain. Instead, they would pay more attention to the changes in the air currents, the changes in temperature, and the changes in humidity. Under such circumstances, if someone who was used to traveling by walking on the ground stepped on this path, it was obvious how they would feel. They would definitely feel that there were obstacles everywhere, and that there were points that were difficult to cross. They would also feel that their way of traveling was very unsuitable for this path. In this case, in order to walk through this path, they would naturally start to change their way of traveling. They would gradually change from walking on the ground to flying in the sky. Of course, this was not an easy thing to do. To directly change from walking to flying was obviously too big of a leap. To directly reach the heavens in one step was obviously too difficult. Therefore, generally speaking, after changing their way of traveling, they would at most be able to glide. And to change from walking to gliding, This was equivalent to not only breaking away from their own way of traveling, but also unable to reach the way of traveling of the person who opened the path. In the end, they would be in an awkward state where they could neither go up nor down. This was also the current situation of the fifth tribulation cultivator who had just become a fifth tribulation cultivator. This kind of change obviously did not have many benefits for the cultivator. However, this kind of change was unavoidable. After all, the path was right there. If one did not change their way of traveling, they would encounter countless dangers that should not have appeared and difficulties that should not have appeared. Under such circumstances, in order to pass through the path, one could only obviously adjust their way of traveling. And this kind of adjustment, as long as one adapted to the path, would naturally be closer to the way of traveling of the existence who opened the path. This was the true nature of the cultivation path of the fifth tribulation cultivator who opened the path, distorting the cultivation path of the cultivators who tried to advance along the path. It was easy to imagine how difficult it was to avoid such distortion. It could be said that as long as they wanted to advance along the path, this kind of distortion would definitely exist. Those fourth tribulation cultivators quickly realized this, and their expressions became even more solemn. Most of them could not accept the fact that their path of cultivation had been distorted. After all, their own cultivation path could be said to be condensed from their own everything. If their cultivation path was distorted, it was almost equivalent to their own everything being distorted. Chapter 3191. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine how much these transcendent experts hated this state. It was precisely because of this that they had stopped moving at this moment. Even if they were willing to sacrifice their lives for the boundless world and the world they cared about, it didn't mean that they were willing to let their ego be distorted. Clearly, the fact that their paths had been distorted meant that their ego had also been distorted. This was the mentality of cultivators. Even if they gave up their lives and the world they cared about, it was equivalent to giving up on themselves. Faced with the risk of directly giving up on themselves and turning themselves into another existence that was not themselves, they still hesitated. This kind of mentality was very natural for these fourth tribulation experts. None of them felt that there was anything wrong with this situation. However, what should they do next? Now, they knew that this distortion was almost inevitable, unless the path they chose was the most suitable path for them to advance in. Otherwise, no matter what, the distortion would continue from the moment they set foot on that path. When they finally reacted, it was already too late and they could no longer return to the past. However, it was clear that although the relationship between the path and the cultivation path was similar to the relationship between the mortal path and the way to travel, the truth was that the cultivation path was hundreds of millions of times more complicated than the way to travel. No matter how many ways to travel, at the end of the day, there were only a few major categories. What about the cultivation path? Almost every cultivator had their own unique path of cultivation. Moreover, the gap between different cultivation paths was as huge as the difference between the major categories of the way to travel. Under such circumstances, the cultivation path that was most suitable for them would definitely deviate from the cultivation path of those experts. As long as there was a deviation, the effects of distortion would always exist. In the end, naturally, this distortion would continue to accumulate until it reached a certain point where it could no longer be salvaged. The fourth tribulation experts were very clear about this fact. It was also because they were clear about this that they understood how difficult it was. That was why they didn't think too much about it. That's why everyone chose the same path. This isn't a wise decision. In the end, a fourth tribulation expert voiced out what everyone was thinking. Since the path had such a strong distortion effect on them, it was obvious that everyone chose the same path. Regardless of their own cultivation path, if they all chose the path that was most suitable for a certain cultivation path, then it was obviously not appropriate. This path was ultimately different from the true path between the fifth and sixth tribulation. If it was the true path, then it would naturally be able to open up many paths. From the perspective of mortals, the true, correct path was to achieve perfection in all aspects. For example, The road would be flat enough, the air would be stable enough, and there would be no sudden gust of wind. For example, the road wouldn't be too complicated, and there wouldn't be a big loop at a certain place. For example, the road wouldn't suddenly shrink into a cliff at a certain place, and so on. Such a path would naturally be able to adapt to all kinds of traveling methods. Whether it was flying, walking, riding a carriage, or simply rolling forward, it would be the most convenient. At the same time, the true path was similar. The truly correct path was definitely a path that could adapt to the countless paths of cultivation. For such a path, there was naturally no such thing as the most suitable cultivation path. For such a path, any cultivation path would be the most suitable cultivation path for that path. Under such circumstances, the path naturally wouldn't have any distortions. However, it was clear that none of the paths in front of the transcendent beings were the true path. These paths were developed by the fifth tribulation experts according to their own cultivation paths. They were paths that were forcefully created from nothing. These paths were only connected from the starting point to the ending point. Not to mention whether it could be walked. Even if it could be walked, it would only be equivalent to a narrow path, a path that was only suitable for that type of cultivation path. Of course, this did not mean that these paths could not ultimately become the true path. If a cultivator finally walked this path and had the time and energy to modify, expand, and stabilize the path, they would naturally be able to turn this narrow path into a path that led to the heavens. At that time, this path would naturally become the true path. However, the current situation was that these roads were still narrow and winding paths. Even if a fourth tribulation expert used their absolute talent to walk this path, they simply did not have the time to modify, perfect, and expand the path. This caused this path to end up as a small and winding path in the end. It was difficult to become a path that led to the heavens. However, if one chooses a different path, even though there are fewer distortions, the chances of successfully walking it are also smaller. A fourth tribulation expert side. Among the millions of paths, it was naturally impossible to find a path that was completely consistent with their own cultivation path, which was also the path that was most suitable for their cultivation path. After all, these paths were not opened by them, and the cultivators who opened these paths, no matter how great their Tao cultivation was, were only similar to the Tao of cultivation of some of the cultivators among them. It was impossible for them to be exactly the same. And if they were not exactly the same, those paths would naturally not be completely suitable for them, or rather, completely compatible. However, just like what was mentioned above, even though there were no paths that were completely compatible, there were still some paths that were similar. Just like how there would be similarities between different types of traveling on an ordinary road, if one were to carefully search for different paths of cultivation, there would always be some paths of cultivation that were more similar than others. And these paths that were more similar would be the paths that the fourth tribulation experts were more suitable for. In this way, if the fourth tribulation experts wanted to find a path that was more suitable for them, they would naturally be able to find a path that was more suitable for them. If they set foot on a path like that, the distortion of their own path of cultivation would naturally be less than if they set foot on another path. However, it was obvious that if they set foot on such a path, there would obviously be a huge problem. That was, after they set foot on those paths, it would be difficult for them to reach the end. It would be difficult for them to walk that path. This was also the fundamental reason why they had chosen this path that everyone was going to take after their initial discussion. Therefore, the fourth tribulation experts were now faced with a dilemma. Should they choose to maintain their own self, or should they choose to have a higher chance of success? For these four tribulation experts who were willing to sacrifice themselves and the world they cared about, if this was only for themselves, they would still be able to convince themselves to accept the option that had the highest chance of success, even though they were very reluctant and very repulsed in their hearts. In other words, they would choose this path that had a higher chance of success and ignore the distortion that their own cultivation path would suffer in the process. After all, no matter what, this distorted cultivation path was still far from what they had decided to give up, their lives, and even everything that they cared about in the world. The reason why they were unwilling, unwilling and rejected this choice was because of the cultivators' instincts towards self-preservation. And this instinct, coupled with their fearless and sacrificial mentality, could not stop them for too long. As long as they had enough time to prepare themselves mentally, it would not be a problem to defeat this attack in the end. Even so, their hearts were still filled with unwillingness and unwillingness, and they still felt extremely repulsed. However, it was clear that the current situation did not only concern them. The current situation concerned all the transcendents in the world. It must be known that the ones taking the test right now were not themselves, nor were they the fourth tribulation experts. All the transcendents in the world had to take the same test. In other words, if they made a decision to ignore the distortion of themselves and their own cultivation path, then in the end, all the transcendents in the world would have to ignore the distortion of themselves and their own cultivation path. This situation was clearly a huge disaster for the endless world. It must be known that the cultivation path was the accumulation of everything that a cultivator possessed. It could be said that the cultivation path was the cultivator's life history, as well as their future and future. For the cultivation path to be distorted, for the cultivators themselves, it was a betrayal of themselves, a betrayal of their history, and a betrayal of their future. Because of this, once the distortion appeared, the transcendents would lose their future and their foundation. Let alone improving in the future, it might even be difficult for them to maintain their realm. All the transcendents would lose their future and their foundation. Needless to say, this would affect the transcendents themselves, and it would also be an inconceivable disaster for the endless world. What were the transcendents to the endless world? They were the foundation of the endless world. They were existences that could suppress the authority of Luo Fan, the creator of the endless world, to the point where it could no longer be seen. Right now, their entire subconscious was acting as an existence similar to the endless world's heavenly Tao. Under such circumstances, any changes that occur to the transcendents would inevitably be reflected in the endless world. In that case, when all the transcendents lost their future and their foundations, what did that mean for the boundless world? Was there any need to say more? It was almost the same as the endless world losing its future and foundation. If this really happened, then the endless world's tribulations would be considered a victory without a win. The endless world's tribulations had descended to test the endless world. For the endless world to suffer disasters, it was a victory. Although the fourth tribulation powerhouses did not understand this clearly, they all felt it. He knew that if all the transcendents in the world were to be distorted, it would be a huge disaster for the endless world. Because of this, although they had used all sorts of reasons to convince themselves to endure the distortion of the cultivation path, they still did not dare to do this out of consideration for the countless transcendents outside. Then what should we do? A fourth tribulation powerhouse sighed and asked with an irritated expression. His words were almost interrogative. However, none of the fourth tribulation powerhouses present could answer this question. They could either choose to destroy the endless world's foundation and future, or choose to destroy 80% or even 90% of the endless world. This choice was naturally not so easy to make. Even though the fourth tribulation powerhouses here were not stingy with their sacrifices, they still had to make the same choice. Facing this situation, the six tribulation powerhouses who were watching from the side frowned slightly. In the past, the six tribulation powerhouses acted as if they did not exist and did not interfere with the fourth tribulation powerhouse's efforts. This was because the fourth tribulation powerhouses were developing very well. Although the number of fourth tribulation powerhouses sacrificed was extremely high, their progress could still be seen at all times. Because of this progress, they could calmly watch from the side. But now, the situation had clearly changed. The fourth tribulation powerhouses had clearly reached a bottleneck. If they continued to watch from the side, the situation would probably slide into an abyss that they did not want to see. However, there was still a problem that prevented them from directly taking action at this time. This problem was, but if we participate now, will the tribulations be triggered because of this? They were six tribulation powerhouses, But because of their previous restraint, the endless world's tribulations were not strong enough to test the fifth tribulation powerhouses. Under such circumstances, if they forcefully took action, it seemed that no one knew how much of an impact it would have on the endless world's tribulations. Perhaps the endless world's tribulations would just glance at them and ignore them. Perhaps they would directly unleash their potential and completely pull them into the tribulations. Chapter 3192. It was precisely because of this that none of the six tribulation experts really did make a move, even though they already had the intention to. They just kept thinking about how to achieve their goal without touching the sensitive nerves of the endless tribulations of heaven and earth. In fact, ever since the endless tribulations of heaven and earth began, they had been thinking about this all the time. As six tribulation experts, once they started thinking about a problem, it was impossible for them not to have any achievements. Previously, they had chosen a path in front of the four tribulation experts and left this secret realm. This was part of their achievements. At that moment, the six tribulation experts communicated with each other. Dozens of them directly chose the path that was the easiest to change. The four tribulation experts were originally in a dilemma. Suddenly, they realized that the six tribulation experts had chosen a path at the same time. How could they not know that the six tribulation experts had made a move again? For a moment, all the four tribulation experts put aside their thoughts and focused all their attention on the six tribulation experts. At this moment, the aura of the six tribulation experts was unimaginably obvious. Of course, this was the aura that had been changed and suppressed by the endless tribulations of heaven and earth. It wasn't their true aura. If it was their true aura, the strength would probably reach a level that the four tribulation experts couldn't sense at all. It would even reach the level where it could directly touch the endless tribulations of heaven and earth, causing the endless tribulations of heaven and earth to erupt with its true potential. With such danger, how could these six tribulation experts reveal their true aura without holding back? As a result, even though they were emitting an extremely powerful aura, it was only extremely powerful compared to the fourth tribulation powerhouses. Compared to themselves, it was still indescribably weak. But this aura, at this moment, vividly displayed the various changes inside and outside of the six tribulation experts' bodies, and even the various changes in their bodies and minds. At this moment, it was naturally an exaggeration for the four tribulation experts to say that they could sense all the changes in their bodies and minds. However, with such an obvious display of aura, it was enough for them to understand every process of their cultivation. The gazes of these six tribulation experts were naturally not something that the four tribulation or five tribulation experts could compare to. In their eyes, there wasn't much difference between the many paths revealed by the endless tribulations of heaven and earth. As long as they were willing, they could change every single one of them into the correct path. Although there were still some differences in the size of these roads, they were still unimaginably narrow compared to the size of their bodies. Under such circumstances, the cultivation method they chose at this time was naturally completely according to their own pace, using their own way of walking, or in other words, using their own cultivation path to forcefully smooth this path. Different six tribulation experts naturally had different cultivation paths. Their attitudes towards the path were shockingly similar. They both practically didn't care about the path and only advanced at their own pace. Since these six tribulation experts were making a move at this time, it was naturally to deal with the predicament of those fourth tribulation experts. At this moment, the cultivation path of these six tribulation powerhouses involved many aspects. If it was on an ordinary road, it would involve flying in the sky, running on the ground, sitting in a car, crawling on the ground, and so on. It could be said that even though this wasn't enough to display all the cultivation methods, it was enough to display the general direction of cultivation, how to smooth this path, how to pass through this path without being distorted or affected. For the fourth tribulation cultivators, it was like a bolt of lightning had suddenly appeared in the boundless darkness. This bolt of lightning was so bright and dazzling that it instantly illuminated the minds of these fourth tribulation experts, causing them, who were in a dilemma, to suddenly discover that there was a third choice in front of them, a choice that could satisfy both sides. It can actually be like this. At this moment, those fourth tribulation experts hungrily absorbed the various mysteries displayed by those sixth tribulation experts when they passed through the path. They tried their best to absorb the endless information that was revealed, constantly merging it into their own hearts and turning it into their own foundation. No matter how much those six tribulation experts slowed down, their own realms were still there. The time it took for them to complete the path was far faster than those fourth tribulation experts or even fifth tribulation experts. It was like a giant that was as large as a mountain and a tiny person that was as small as an ant were hurrying along a certain distance. For a tiny person like him, it would take several days and nights to cross this stretch of road. However, for the giant, it only needed to move its body slightly to cross this distance. Under such circumstances, no matter how much the giant slowed down its movements and suppressed its desire to move, it couldn't possibly take a few days and nights to complete this journey. Perhaps it would only take a few breaths, a few minutes, or at most a few dozen minutes to complete this distance. There was actually not much difference between the difficulty of reaching a certain degree and the difficulty of reaching a certain degree. If one wanted to speed up, the difficulty of reaching a certain degree was obvious. Anyone could see how difficult it was at a glance. In contrast, the difficulty of reaching a certain degree was not so obvious. If ordinary people did not think about it carefully, they might not think that this was a difficult thing. After all, it was just slowing down. If one cannot be fast, they could be slow, right? If one's speed did not reach that threshold, then no matter how fast one sped up, one would still fall behind in the end. On the other hand, there was no threshold for slow. No matter how slow one was, even if one was as slow as a snail, there would not be much of an impact in the pursuit of slow speed. On the contrary, if one's speed was slow enough, then it might even be an advantage. After all, if one's body was slow enough, then the amount of slowing down needed to reach a certain threshold would be greatly reduced. Naturally, it would be more convenient and advantageous than being fast. However, it was obvious that the truth was not that simple. Just like being fast, being slow was obviously not an easy thing to do. It could even be said that it was also a kind of talent. It was just as easy to be slow as it was to be fast. Just like ordinary living beings, even the most ordinary ones could run and walk. Running was as fast as usual. Walking was as slow as usual. This was almost an instinct of life, so it was naturally not difficult for them. However, if one wanted to be fast to a certain extent, it was obviously not something that ordinary living beings could achieve. It was either their race was special, or they had extraordinary power. Otherwise, no matter how fast they were, they could only reach a certain limit and not continue to improve. Just like being fast, it was the same for being slow. If one wanted to be slow to a certain extent, it would obviously depend on one's race or extraordinary power. For example, a snail was obviously slower than a tortoise. This was the influence of race. Unless one borrowed extraordinary power, this nature could not be changed no matter what. As for where the difficulty of being slow was, it would actually be clear if one described it slightly. For example, a distance of 1 meter needed to be covered in 3 days. During the process, one could not even be noticed by observers at all times. Just the thought of how difficult this was enough to make people despair. This was the difficulty of being fast and slow in the mortal world. With this level of difficulty, one could easily surpass it as long as one had extraordinary power. However, this was only the speed of the mortal world. For the current 6 tribulation powerhouses, the situation was naturally more complicated. If they wanted to surpass it, the difficulty would also be even more astonishing. However, it was not something that any extraordinary power could surpass. After all, what they were talking about now was the speed of extraordinary power itself. It was precisely because of this that even if the 6 tribulation powerhouses wanted the 4th tribulation powerhouses to see more clearly, obtain more information, and absorb more nutrients, they would still be able to complete their respective paths after a few months. However, because of their own bodies and their own realms, Even if they tried their best to slow down, they still managed to complete their respective paths after a few months. One by one, they completed the requirements of the endless tribulations of the universe and directly left. Not only did they leave this mystic realm, but they also left this world created by the endless tribulations of the universe. A few months might be considered a relatively long time for ordinary living beings. However, for these fourth tribulation and sixth tribulation powerhouses, it was merely the blink of an eye. For a path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation, it was even shorter than the blink of an eye. Relying on these few months, it was naturally a fool's dream to want to completely grasp a certain path, no matter how big or small, without leaving anything out. For these four tribulation powerhouses, after observing for a few months, their biggest gain was to establish a rough outline of the different paths of cultivation to pass through that path. However, there were still too many specific details waiting for them to fill in. In this way, it was actually very difficult to say how much help it would be for them to truly walk that path. Only knowing the outline allowed them to understand the direction they should work towards, so that they wouldn't be at a complete loss and completely clueless about what to do. However, there were still too many traps in it. Some things couldn't be avoided just because they knew it. Even if they knew that they could pass through this path by walking, flying was still countless times more convenient than walking. If they walked, it might take a few years to complete the path. If they flew, it would only take a few days to reach the end. Under such circumstances, even if they knew that they could pass through by walking, could they resist the urge to fly? Especially when they had the ability to fly, it was even more difficult to resist the urge. And on these paths, it was obviously the cultivation path of the fourth tribulation powerhouses. And flying was obviously the cultivation path of the person who opened the path. It was also the cultivation path that was most suitable to pass through that path. Of course, perhaps on the other hand, flying might take a few years, but walking might take a few days. In the secular world, this was naturally very inconceivable and almost defied logic. However, in the cultivation path, this couldn't be more normal. Moreover, it didn't affect the previous conclusion at all. Therefore, even if they knew that other cultivation paths could pass through this path, once they set foot on that path, they would still be affected. What should be distorted would still be distorted in the end. Therefore, even if these fourth tribulation powerhouses knew all this, they were still destined to continue sacrificing. At most, compared to the despair of sacrificing before, there was a little more hope after the sacrifice. In the past, even if they sacrificed their own lives and their own selves, it could only prove the despair of this tribulation. It could only prove that the countless transcendents outside had no hope at all. But now, their sacrifice gave them some more hope. Their sacrifice allowed them to have the hope of smoothing out that path and exploring different paths of cultivation, as well as the specific methods to pass through that path. However, this also meant that their previous assumption that a fourth tribulation expert would be able to walk the path of cultivation, and that every cultivator would be able to learn every detail of their cultivation, and that they would be able to guide all the transcendents in the world to reach the requirements of the endless heavenly tribulations, was now completely out of the question. If all the transcendents used the same method to walk this path, then what awaited them would definitely be distortion. Moreover, the greater the gap between the cultivation path and the path of the person who opened the path, the greater the distortion. After understanding this, they naturally knew that what awaited the transcendents would be a situation that was thousands of times more difficult than what they had originally expected. It was already impossible for them to sit back and wait for success. Even if the final correct path was discovered, they would still need to combine their own cultivation paths to walk that path. The difficulty of this path was actually not that different from actually cultivating that path. It was because they knew this that the fourth tribulation powerhouses were inexplicably depressed. They had sacrificed so much and were prepared to sacrifice even more. But the final result was not as perfect as they had expected. This suddenly made them doubt the meaning of their sacrifice. Chapter 3193. In the end, These fourth tribulation experts were the most outstanding group among the countless transcendent cultivators in the world. Moreover, transcendent transcendents were the most outstanding group of cultivators. With such a comparison, one could see how extraordinary they were as experts of the fourth tribulation. The current situation was indeed different from what these fourth tribulation experts had expected. It was much worse than what they had expected. However, they still managed to grasp the key in this complicated and inexplicable situation. In the end, a fourth tribulation expert sighed and said what the other four tribulation experts had already considered: "Our task has become heavier." The other fourth tribulation experts all had complicated expressions on their faces. Their eyes regained their determination, and all the confusion that existed before had been swept away at this moment. It is impossible to find a path that is suitable for all cultivation paths. Not to mention the fact that we only have so many people. Even if we have enough people, we are still insignificant compared to the transcendent cultivators in the world outside. What he had discovered was suitable for certain cultivation paths, but it was still far from enough. If that is the case, we will only be able to save a small number of fellow Taoists. A fourth tribulation expert sighed and explained the difficulty that everyone had previously faced. Therefore, there is only one way, and that is to open up this path. Then, this path will become the true path. Another fourth tribulation expert continued. As long as this path was truly opened up and became the true path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation, then it would naturally be able to adapt to all cultivation paths. And as long as it could adapt to all cultivation paths, then for all living beings, their cultivation paths would no longer be distorted by the path and their ego. For the fourth tribulation powerhouses, this was the best outcome for the time being. Of course, after this, there was still another difficulty for the transcendent cultivators. Even if they saw the true path, they would still have to overcome many obstacles to pass through. Whether they would succeed or not would depend on luck. This problem was actually the one that they had considered in the beginning. It was also the problem that these fourth tribulation experts had prepared to sacrifice themselves and their everything to solve. However, this problem would no longer be a problem if they could truly open up that path and make it the correct path. To open up that path, one had to cover all aspects of that path. Their cultivation on this path, their improvement on this path, and their advancement on this path were all included in it for them. As such, as long as they were able to extract the contents of this process, it would naturally be enough to help the countless transcendents outside. It was even to the extent that those who had transcended might even be able to sense the correct path between the fifth and sixth tribulations in advance, allowing them to obtain boundless benefits in the process, allowing their own cultivation paths to obtain all sorts of inconceivable improvements. It could be said that if things really developed this way, the endless world tribulation this time would be a great opportunity for them. Because of this special characteristic, it could be said that as long as one completed the first step of the four tribulations, it would be equivalent to completing everything. This was also the fundamental reason why many of the fourth tribulation experts did not discuss this matter. Of course, many of the four tribulation experts were aware that even if they managed to reach this step, not all of them would be able to walk the correct path and escape from this predicament. Among them, there would definitely be a large portion of the transcendents who could not walk the correct path, even with all sorts of conveniences. In the end, they would be defeated and die on the path. Even a world that they cared about would exist along with the defeated cultivators. After all, the difference in strength of the transcendents was just too great. From those who had despaired, to the four tribulation experts, and even a small number of fifth tribulation experts, with such a difference in strength, it would be ridiculous to say that every transcendent could walk the path between the fifth and sixth tribulations at the same time. It was like a baby that had just learned how to turn over. If he was given the brain of a postdoc, would he be able to complete all the research that a postdoc could do? Obviously, this was impossible. A baby was a baby. No matter how much the brain of a postdoc was obtained, it was still a baby. It was the same for the transcendents whose cultivation realm was insufficient. Even if they could obtain the qualifications to walk the path between the fifth and sixth tribulations with the help of the endless tribulations, it was as if they were carrying a heavy burden. It was simply impossible for them to solve all the problems they encountered along the way. For them, the path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation was filled with countless obstacles and traps. It was also a path filled with countless dangers. For such a path, even if they had countless experiences telling them how to take each step, the possibility of them reaching the end and completing the requirements of the endless tribulations was minuscule. However, this was something that could only be overcome by those who had transcended themselves. For these fourth tribulation experts, they had completed everything in their plan. This was already the best they could do. No matter what, that path still required the transcendents to step on it and walk it themselves. No matter what, it was impossible for them to walk this path on behalf of the transcendents. Therefore, even if they knew that the result would be like this, they could only pretend that they didn't know and pretend that they were satisfied with everything. The sixth tribulation experts nodded inwardly at the judgment and decision of the fourth tribulation experts. Clearly, they weren't going in the wrong direction. Previously, when the sixth tribulation experts chose that path, it was easy for the fourth tribulation experts to feel that as long as they found enough cultivation paths, they could avoid the result that they were worried about. But in fact, if the fourth tribulation experts really chose that path, they would obviously be walking on the wrong path. It could be said that if they worked hard in that direction, the more they worked, the more complicated the situation would become. In the end, they would be further away from solving the real problem. And if that was the case, all the sacrifices they had made from the beginning until now, and even in the long future, would be completely in vain. On the other hand, directly choosing to work hard in the direction of that path, starting in the direction of the correct path, that was obviously grasping the key to survival. Compared with the fourth tribulation experts, the sixth tribulation experts had a clearer understanding of the significance of working hard in this direction. For the fourth tribulation experts, working hard in this direction was just the only way to solve the problem they were facing now. They didn't delve into the other significance of such a choice. However, the sixth tribulation experts were different. They were more transcendental than the fourth tribulation experts. At this time, at a glance, they could see that if they really opened up this path, that would inevitably cause some kind of unimaginable transformation in the endless world. This transformation would greatly change the situation of the endless world, and might even have some incredible effect on the endless world itself. As for why they had such a judgment, it was needless to say. They were the sixth tribulation experts. As the sixth tribulation experts, they had experienced all the levels of the road of Town Master before the sixth level. For people like them, they had a very clear understanding of the entire process of cultivating from zero to the level of a sixth tribulation expert. Although the cultivation process before the endless world could be regarded as opening a new door, it was different from the orthodox cultivation method of the road of Town Master. However, in essence, it was still inferior to the orthodox cultivation method of the road of Town Master. After all, no matter what, the cultivation process in the endless world could only help them become the fifth tribulation experts. Under such a background, if the cultivation method in the endless world could help the cultivators become the sixth tribulation experts, what would the result be? It was hard to say how it would be compared to the levels above the sixth level. However, to a certain extent, such an endless world had obviously caught up with the sixth level of the road of Town Master. That was to say, it had caught up with the level of the road of Town Master they were at now. Although they didn't know what changes would happen at that time, it was obvious that when this step was reached, the endless world would not be able to pass peacefully. There must be some unimaginable changes, indicating that the endless world had caught up with the sixth level of the road of Town Master. For such a result, the sixth tribulation experts had quite complicated feelings. There were inexplicable envy, jealousy, and indescribable expectations. There was no need to say more about envy and jealousy. Others didn't know, but most of them were quite clear about it. The endless world was the creation of a cultivator. Even if it had gone through many transformations, and now there were not many artificial traces. Its essence was still the creation of a cultivator. And a cultivator's creation could actually catch up with the sixth level of the road of Town Master. How could they not be envious and jealous? However, similarly, after this envy and jealousy, they also had inexplicable expectations. The reason for this expectation was nothing else but that if the endless world reached this step, it was very likely that they would also be able to obtain endless benefits from it. Not to mention anything else, just the effect of the incredible flow of time was already something worth looking forward to. It should be known that the flow of time in the endless world had reached the speed of trillions of years here, which was equivalent to the speed of a breath in the outside world. Under this incredible flow of time, it would only take a few years in the outside world, but it would probably take billions of trillions of years in the endless world. If the speed of the creation of the road in the endless world was taken into account, and if it continued to develop smoothly, it would not take thousands of years for the road from the sixth tribulation to the seventh tribulation to be directly opened up by the transcendence in the endless world. And once this road was directly opened up by them, for the sixth tribulation experts, it was equivalent to directly giving them the opportunity to directly become the seventh tribulation experts. After all, as the sixth tribulation experts, they were existences at the highest level in the endless world. If there was a road from the sixth tribulation to the seventh tribulation in the endless world, it would be the easiest for them to obtain this kind of achievement and the easiest to become the seven tribulation experts through this road. Even if it could not be all of them, it must be a part of them. And as the sixth tribulation experts, it was impossible for them to lack confidence, and it was impossible for them to think that there was not a part of them. It was precisely because of this that they had such a complicated mood at this time. They were envious and jealous, and there was also such a strong expectation in their hearts. The sixth tribulation experts were looking forward to it, but they concealed their presence even more. They were afraid that because of their interference, the fourth tribulation experts would change their minds again, and their behavior was clearly the best answer to the decision of the fourth tribulation experts. The fourth tribulation experts were extremely clear that although the sixth tribulation experts could not interfere too much with them, if their decision was wrong, it was impossible for the sixth tribulation experts to not give any hints. At this time, there was no hint at all, and they directly concealed their presence. This in itself was already the best hint, and it proved that there was no mistake in their previous decision. With such encouragement, they naturally no longer held back and directly began to act according to their previous thoughts. And their actions did not seem to be much different from before. Similarly, one by one, they continued to choose that path and try to walk on that path. At the same time, they described everything they saw, heard, thought, and felt on that path in great detail. If ordinary cultivators saw this scene, they would probably doubt whether the mini conflict from before had ever happened. However, the fourth and sixth tribulation experts were very clear that the things that the fourth tribulation expert was talking about had changed slightly compared to before. The focus had already shifted from their own improvement to the road itself. Chapter 3194. Perhaps it was because of the change in focus, but the progress of this fourth tribulation expert was rather slow. In the end, as expected, he collapsed on the way. Of course, in the end, he still managed to push through about 80% of the distance. Compared to the large group of six tribulation experts who easily walked through this path, there was naturally too much of a difference. Even compared to the fourth tribulation expert who was already a fifth tribulation expert, there was still quite a bit of a difference. However, from a certain point of view, his contribution was the most important to the rest of the fourth tribulation experts. The reason was actually very simple. Although the six tribulation experts seemed to be more at ease, the signs of the correct path were also more obvious. However, the six tribulation experts didn't have any explanation at all. Furthermore, even if they had already slowed down their speed to the limit, their speed was still unimaginably fast for the fourth tribulation experts. With all these conditions intertwined, the end result was that the demonstration of the six tribulation powerhouses was only a direction for the fourth tribulation powerhouses. However, There wasn't even the slightest bit of profound mysteries that could truly guide them to the correct path. As for the transcendent expert, who was previously a fourth tribulation expert and was now a fifth tribulation expert, there was no need to mention the process of his path. Although he had walked through that path, his own cultivation path was distorted by that path. It was hard to say how different his current self was from his original self. It could be said that he was a standard example of a mistake. Even the enlightenment that the sixth tribulation experts brought to the fourth tribulation experts couldn't compare. In comparison, what this fourth tribulation cultivator was doing now was different. Although this fourth tribulation expert collapsed halfway, he was still moving in the right direction. During this process, he even clearly described everything he had gained from his exploration and all the dangers he had encountered. With such a comparison, the help he had provided to the fourth tribulation powerhouses was obviously far greater than the sixth tribulation powerhouses and the fifth tribulation powerhouses. Although the fourth tribulation experts had already expected the fourth tribulation expert to collapse halfway, they still felt an inexplicable sense of regret when they saw him collapse halfway. But when they saw him collapse halfway, they still felt an inexplicable sense of regret. What a pity! The four tribulation experts all felt a sense of regret. However, this regret didn't stay in their hearts for too long, because the fate that awaited them wouldn't be much better than that of the fourth tribulation expert. Instead of feeling sentimental about his fate, it was better to think about how to avoid following in his footsteps. The situation after was quite similar to before. It just looked like they were starting from the beginning again. One after another, the four tribulation experts began to explore that path without any hesitation. However, they all collapsed halfway. As for the process of exploring that path, they also slowly advanced. However, compared to the past, almost every four tribulation expert would make some progress when they chose that path. Now, there were many twists and turns in their exploration of the path. Exploring the right path was ultimately not the same as smoothing the path. Smoothing out the path was just using one's own cultivation path to walk that path. The experience of the predecessors would naturally be of great help to them, allowing each of them to advance by standing on the shoulders of the predecessors. In this way, the vast majority of four tribulation experts would naturally be able to improve upon the foundations of their predecessors. But now, if they wanted to explore the right path, it was equivalent to modifying the path. And this modification obviously couldn't be superimposed continuously. Perhaps cultivators who followed a certain path of cultivation felt that this part of the path was already very perfect and that it met the requirements of the correct path. However, for another path of cultivation, such a path might have a fatal flaw. Similarly, using an ordinary path as an analogy, those who use flying to look at the path would feel that the situation below was already quite flat. They would feel that such a path would definitely meet the requirements of those who walked on the ground. But obviously, because they hadn't really walked on the ground before, there were naturally many things that they took for granted. Those paths that looked extremely flat from above might have extremely soft ground in some places. Once they stepped on it, it might be like stepping into a trap. And some places might have some kind of sharp thorns hidden in the soil. If they were to walk on the flat ground, they might accidentally hurt themselves, and so on and so forth. One could almost come up with countless similar situations just by thinking about it. In such a situation, for those who traveled on the ground, the experience of a flyer was useful, but it was obvious that there would be many specious but actually wrong uses. In this case, if they wanted to modify a path that truly suited everyone, they obviously couldn't completely trust those experiences. In this case, the correct path naturally couldn't be superimposed. Repetition would naturally occur because of this. Obviously, there was no essential difference in the path of cultivation. Thus, the fourth tribulation experts' exploration of the path didn't continuously superimpose like before. Instead, it constantly fluctuated. Of course, although it was fluctuating, it was still advancing bit by bit towards the end. After all, even if the correct path explored by different paths of cultivation seemed somewhat specious, it had still been explored in the end. Although their exploration experience couldn't be completely trusted, it was still of considerable value. It was enough to bring a lot of convenience to the fourth tribulation experts in the future, greatly reducing the difficulty of their exploration. With the difficulty reduced, the possibility of them advancing further would naturally be much greater. The result of this was naturally what many of the fourth tribulation powerhouses saw. Although the progress of the exploration often changed, the general process was still constantly advancing. Time passed bit by bit in this secret realm. Unknowingly, hundreds of millions of years had passed. Over these hundreds of millions of years, who knew how many thousands of fourth tribulation experts had already sacrificed themselves? They had thrown their lives and the world they cared about into this tribulation. After their sacrifice, the true, correct path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation was finally gradually discovered. At this moment, many of the fourth tribulation experts were secretly excited. This time, the fourth tribulation expert who was trying to explore the path had the best development trend among the thousands of fourth tribulation experts. His progress was the smoothest. And now, he had already pushed this path to 99%. It felt like he could break through the 99% shackles at any time and directly explore the path completely. Because of this, they were so excited. I hope he succeeds. At this moment, the fourth tribulation experts were all secretly praying. There was actually another reason why these fourth tribulation experts had such strong expectations. It was because the person who was trying to explore the path was not a fourth tribulation expert with astonishing potential. Instead, he was just a very ordinary fourth tribulation expert. He was someone who didn't even have much of a presence before. It was precisely because he was so ordinary that it proved that this path was correct. If this fourth tribulation expert was like the fourth tribulation expert with unlimited potential, a publicly acknowledged genius with a limitless future, then the other four tribulation experts wouldn't have too much expectations for him to reach this step. After all, if he really was a fourth tribulation expert, being able to reach this step and advance the path to 99% of completion would only give the other four tribulation experts the feeling that he was talented enough and wise enough. However, it wouldn't show the correctness of the path at all. In comparison, if this ordinary fourth tribulation expert who didn't have much of a presence and seemed to be able to advance the path to this step, then the only possibility was that this path was extremely correct. After all, if such an ordinary fourth tribulation expert could successfully reach this step, then didn't that prove that anyone who did what he did could also reach this step? And this clearly proved that this path was close to being completely correct. It was because of this consideration that they had such strong expectations at this moment. Under the expectations of many fourth tribulation experts, the fourth tribulation expert who was exploring the path did not disappoint them. Finally, after a few hundred years, he brazenly stepped through the last obstacle and directly walked that path. And because of this, he directly broke through his limit and rose from a fourth tribulation expert to a fifth tribulation expert. At this moment, an indescribable change appeared in the endless world. In a trance, it seemed that the entire endless world had some kind of indescribable vibration out of nowhere. It was a vibration that went straight to the source and was engraved into the deepest part of the endless world. In this vibration, an indescribable feeling of perfection suddenly appeared in the hearts of all living beings in the endless world. It was as if a part of their hearts that had been missing had suddenly returned, making them whole again. And the few fifth tribulation experts who didn't have their own path suddenly felt that the feeling of being able to transcend suddenly disappeared without a trace. It was as if, from now on, they could no longer transcend and leave this endless world. However, as this feeling of transcendence disappeared, they didn't feel the despair of having their path cut off. On the contrary, they felt as if all the shackles on their bodies had been completely released. This is the true birth of the path between fifth tribulation and sixth tribulation. At this moment, those fifth tribulation experts already understood what was going on. Compared to the previous few times when the path appeared, the reaction this time was much greater and more obvious. But in essence, there is still not much difference from the previous few times when the path appeared. And these fifth tribulation experts naturally experienced the process of the path's birth in the past. Therefore, they were naturally very clear about this similarity. At this moment, they were naturally able to link the two together. At the same time, the hundreds of millions of sixth tribulation powerhouses in this endless world suddenly felt their bodies relax, and a subtle barrier between them and the endless world that had always existed collapsed and disappeared in an instant. A feeling that they had returned to the endless world arose spontaneously. However, in contrast, the endless heaven and earth tribulation, which didn't pay much attention to them before, suddenly seemed to pay attention to all of them. The pressure brought by the endless heaven and earth tribulation increased by more than 10 times in the blink of an eye. Although it wasn't to the extent of threatening their lives, it made them feel that the number of actions they could do was more than 10 times less than before. This is the transformation when the path really appears. At this time, those 6 tribulation experts were filled with indescribable shock in their hearts. Although the transformation of the endless world didn't seem to be big, it was an extreme change in essence. In this change, the level of the endless world that could originally only be compared to the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path had become comparable to the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path. If this level of improvement was directly compared to the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path and the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path, it would be incomparably clear. It should be known that any cultivator from the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path who returned to the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path could be said to be almost invincible. Such an existence, even if hundreds of millions of cultivators from the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path joined forces, they still wouldn't be able to pose a real threat to such an existence. And in the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path, there were hundreds of millions of such cultivators from this. It could be seen how huge the gap between the two levels was. At this time, the endless world had crossed the gap of 2 levels. Originally, it could only be compared to the 5th level of the Tao Master's Road, but now it could be compared to the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road. One could imagine how great the improvement was. Although ordinary transcendent experts could feel such a change, they didn't have such a clear feeling because their level was not high enough. For them, the endless world now only released some invisible shackles that shackled them, making them feel free and unfettered that they didn't care about before. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for their attention to be on the changes in the endless world. At this moment, the focus of their attention was still on that path, on the person who had just walked it, or rather, on the person who had discovered the correct path to transcendence. Chapter 3195. Compared to the many changes, the path in front of them had more to do with them. If they could survive this tribulation, they would have plenty of time to experience and comprehend the changes that were going on in the boundless heaven and earth. However, if they couldn't take this path, then they would have no future. Under such circumstances, how could these 4th tribulation experts not know what to focus on? At this moment, all the remaining 4th tribulation experts were trying their best to remember all the details of the path that the 4th tribulation expert had explored. Of course, this kind of memory only deepened their impression. With the memory of these 4th tribulation experts, they could remember many details of the entire process very clearly. The reason why they had to repeat it, even though they could clearly remember, it was naturally because they placed an unimaginable importance on these details. There are still some places that are a bit unclear. In the end, one of the 4th tribulation experts sighed. Although the true path had been explored, this didn't mean that they had reached the end of their exploration. After all, the true path was only the foundation that they had thought it was at the beginning. Or rather, it was only the beginning. It was still extremely far away from the true end. The direction that they were working towards was naturally to explore the specific method of this correct path bit by bit. In the end, they would form something that was close to a standard answer so that more transcendents could use this standard answer to walk this path and complete the requirements of the endless tribulations. This could be said to be a kind of wishful thinking. After all, different cultivation paths would have different results when walking the same path. Something like a standard answer might exist for other problems, but it clearly didn't exist for this kind of path that transcended realms. Therefore, it could almost be said that from the beginning, the standard answer that they wanted to explore was completely impossible to succeed. However, this didn't mean that their exploration was meaningless. It was just like the truth that scientific civilizations talked about. In the eyes of scientific civilizations, the truth was something that could only be approached continuously, but it was something that could not be obtained in the end. Facing this kind of truth that could only be approached continuously, but it was something that could not be truly obtained, no scientific civilization gave up on trying to approach it. Instead, they put all their wisdom and energy into approaching the truth. Similarly, this standard answer was similar to the truth. It was also an existence that could only be approached, but could never truly be obtained. Under such circumstances, it went without saying that the efforts of those experts who had undergone the fourth tribulation were meaningless. Their hard work was naturally to get closer to the standard answer. Eventually, they gradually found an answer that could replace the standard answer with a lower degree of precision. These four tribulation powerhouses were actually quite clear about this. Perhaps in the beginning, they would still be a little vague about it and would not be able to clearly recognize this point. However, after experiencing so much and seeing so much, the fog covering this truth had naturally been lifted by them. After letting out a sigh, he no longer hesitated and chose that path. As he stepped onto it, his aura changed indescribably, and he began to move forward along the path. Compared to the previous four tribulation experts, he was much more confident. After all, he had already confirmed that the path before him could be considered as the correct path. In other words, the distortion this path had on his path of cultivation had weakened to a negligible level. Under such circumstances, it was still dangerous for him to set foot on this path, and it was still possible for him and the world he cared about to be completely destroyed. However, compared to the fact that it would be a disaster regardless of whether he passed or not, this situation was already much better than the fact that it would be a disaster whether he passed or not. It was precisely because the situation was much better that he couldn't help but feel relaxed. A path had been cleared, but this was only the first step to the formation of a new path. Whether it was a path between the secular world or a path that connected realms, it was the same. For a path between the secular world, it required many people to walk on this path for a long time before it could truly take shape. Only then would all the various dangers and obstacles be truly smoothed out. Similarly, a path that connected realms was the same principle. A single person walking on this path only proved that this path could be walked. More and more people had to pass through this path in the future. Only then could the various ups and downs and obstacles on this path be flattened, and only then could this path truly take shape. For example, in the eyes of the current fourth tribulation experts, there were clearly some parts of this path that weren't smooth. There were some indescribable ups and downs. And these indescribable ups and downs naturally needed to be stepped on again and again, explored again and again. Only then could it become the same as the other parts of the path, so that it wouldn't become a shortcoming or an obstacle. In the end, the fourth tribulation expert also succeeded and walked on this path, allowing another path to be chosen in this part of the world. As for himself, he directly disappeared into the void of the many paths. The results of this expert's previous efforts were also considerable. Although it wasn't much, he had solved a few difficult problems that the previous expert hadn't been able to truly analyze. However, it was precisely because he had solved those difficult problems that the hidden dangers of the path had also been revealed. Then, there were naturally four tribulation experts that followed and once again entered the path. This time, his luck wasn't very good. Although he had solved a few difficult problems in the end, it had also caused some hidden problems to be revealed. However, in the end, he didn't walk this path and regretfully fell at the juncture of 97% of the path. The world that he cared about, as well as himself, had all died along with the endless world, adding a trace of bitterness to this endless tribulation of the world. Facing such a situation, the four tribulation experts could only sigh inwardly and put it aside for the time being. Although it was a pity that he had fallen at this moment, what right did they have to be immersed in this kind of pity? Perhaps their fates would be no different from his. The following development was quite similar to the previous 2 times. Similarly, the cultivators chose their paths and solved some difficult problems. It could be considered as smoothing out some of the dangers on the path. But similarly, after they solved some problems, even more problems appeared. It was as if they were only grabbing onto the end of a thread. Once they pulled, the thread would become longer and longer. This situation continued round after round. In the end, even after all the 4 tribulation experts had thrown themselves into it, increasing the number of paths in this world by a few million, there were still all sorts of difficulties and dangers on that path. Even if the problems they had to solve were already counted in the tens of millions, even if the problems and dangers they felt at the beginning were similar to what they were now, these problems and dangers still existed. In the end, 90% of the 4th tribulation experts who tried this path succeeded, and 10% failed. Moreover, most of the 10% that failed were failures at the very beginning. In other words, although it seemed that the problems and dangers had always existed, in fact, as they sacrificed themselves and explored, the difficulty of walking through this path was still constantly decreasing. Although it couldn't be reduced to 0 in the end, and there was no guarantee that the people who tried later would succeed 100% of the time, the success rate had clearly been greatly increased. Now, it had reached the point where it could be directly confirmed that they would succeed under normal circumstances. We've tried our best. The last 4th tribulation expert sighed at this moment. He didn't choose the path to explore. That wasn't his mission. His mission was to pass on the detailed information that had been discovered by so many 4th tribulation experts who had sacrificed their lives. He wanted to inform the countless transcendent beings who were waiting outside. Only by passing on the results of their exploration would their sacrifices have meaning. Otherwise, all their sacrifices would have been in vain if they didn't spread the news, if they didn't let the transcendents know about the results of their efforts. Then all of their sacrifices would be meaningless. Thus, many of the 4th tribulation experts had already left behind a 4th tribulation expert to record all of this. They did their best to pass on the results of their exploration, so that all the transcendents would know everything. At this moment, the 4th tribulation expert was the only one left in the secret plane. Although there were a lot of other cultivators, the 4th tribulation expert was the only one left. Although there were many other cultivators, they were all 6 tribulation experts. Seeing that all the 4th tribulation experts had been sacrificed until only one was left, the 6 tribulation experts naturally didn't want to waste any more time here. Then they all chose the path at the same time and began to advance along it. They reached the end of the path at an unimaginable speed, then left and disappeared from this secret realm. As for them choosing the same path at the same time, that wasn't strange at all. These paths weren't one-on-one. They were just like ordinary paths. However, it didn't mean that only one person could reach the end of the path before others could step onto it. Ordinary paths didn't reject passers-by. No matter where they went, even if they had just left the starting point, the path wouldn't reject anyone else. Thus, it wasn't surprising that so many 6 tribulation experts chose the same path at the same time. Not to mention these 6 tribulation experts, according to the setting of the endless heavenly tribulations, these paths were open to all transcendents. In other words, even if hundreds of millions of transcendents chose the same path at the same time, it would still be in line with the rules. In comparison, it was just a few 6 tribulation experts choosing the same path at the same time. It couldn't be any easier. Facing the choices of so many 6 tribulation experts, the last 4th tribulation expert had an indescribable expression on his face. He seemed a bit shocked and a bit regretful. Naturally, he was shocked because these 6 tribulation experts had passed the path so easily. Compared to the 4 tribulation experts, it was thousands of times easier. Regretfully, these 6 tribulation experts had some scruples and couldn't interfere too much with the endless heavenly tribulations. Otherwise, if they were like the previous 4th tribulation experts, constantly sharing the whole process of their exploration and all the details, Why would the previous transcendent experts need to sacrifice so many people? Perhaps they didn't even need to sacrifice a single one. Thinking of this, how could he not feel regretful? However, it was obvious that this kind of regret could only remain as a regret. Now that things had come to this, it was too late to say anything. Moreover, how could he influence the decisions of the 6 tribulation experts? Even if things didn't need to go to this step, if the 6 tribulation experts felt that it was necessary, then they could only do it. Even with such complicated emotions, he didn't stop looking at the traces that the 6 tribulation experts revealed when they passed through the path. Although the 6 tribulation experts didn't explain, they still slowed down as much as possible and did their best to reveal the corresponding changes in their bodies as they moved forward. Under such circumstances, even if there weren't many, the 4 tribulation expert could still feel the various thoughts and insights of the 6 tribulation experts. This would be of great help to the details of the path that he was about to pass on. Although it wasn't enough to completely change the process and details of the path, it was better than nothing. After a long while, the 4th tribulation cultivator let out a long sigh and directly dispersed the secret realm. His figure reappeared outside the secret realm, among the many transcending cultivators. This 4 tribulation expert was left to the end and was given the task of passing on the information that the 4th tribulation experts had sacrificed so much to explore. This was naturally not a simple task. Of course, this task couldn't be given to any random 4th tribulation expert. Chapter 3196. The reason why he was given this task out of all the 4 tribulation experts was because he was the most suitable existence for this step. First of all, as a 4th tribulation expert, his cultivation had already reached the peak of the 4th tribulation. It could be said that among all 4th tribulation experts, no matter how one looked at it, he was an existence that stood at the peak of the 4th tribulation. This foundation allowed him to have sufficient understanding of that path. At the very least, compared to other 4 tribulation experts, he was the most qualified. After all, only by having sufficient understanding of that path would one be able to relay the method of passing through that path without any deviation. Otherwise, if one's knowledge was half-baked, the moment the method was spoken, there would be an oversight and there would be deviation. It was clear that under such circumstances, the slightest deviation in his narration, even if it was just the slightest bit, could cause millions of transcendents to fall halfway through their journey. It was impossible for the 4th tribulation experts not to know this. Thus, if they wanted to leave behind a cultivator who had sacrificed countless lives to bring out the results, they naturally had to choose the most qualified cultivator who could avoid any deviation in the relay. Of course, in reality, this was only relative in order to avoid any deviation in the narration. In order to truly avoid any deviation, it was naturally necessary to have a cultivator whose cultivation base was above this path relay the information to them. Only when one's cultivation was above this path would one be able to look down on this path from above. Only then would one be able to truly see this path clearly. Naturally, only then would one be able to truly convey all the contents of this path. In comparison, 4 tribulation experts, even peak 4th tribulation experts, were still a bit lacking. However, it was clear that in this secret realm, they could only choose from those who had undergone the 4th tribulation. After all, although there were many 6 tribulation experts here, they all had their misgivings and didn't dare to participate too much. If they didn't even dare to explain the cultivation process too much, how could they possibly be the one to relay? Thus, they could only find the most qualified 4th tribulation expert to be the one to relay. If that was the only condition, the 4th tribulation expert wouldn't have been chosen as the one to relay. After all, although there weren't too many peak 4th tribulation experts, there weren't too few either. If he wanted to find them, he would be able to find a few hundred of them. Under such circumstances, if there were no other conditions, the probability of picking a 4 tribulation powerhouse was only 1 in 100. The reason why he was chosen in the end was because he had another special characteristic. That was, his path of cultivation had an unbelievable ability to reproduce. In other words, his cultivation path's ability to reproduce this aspect far surpassed most other cultivation paths. The path of cultivation and the existence of special abilities were naturally completely different. In reality, any path of cultivation that could be called a path of cultivation naturally possessed the potential to be omnipotent. In other words, if one really wanted to dig deeper, any path of cultivation could touch upon any domain and accomplish any extraordinary feat. However, it would not be like special abilities, where a certain special ability could only do one thing, while other areas were not much different from ordinary people. However, since it was a different path of cultivation, there would naturally be differences. This kind of difference was definitely an all-around difference. Whether it was the cultivation method or the path of advancement, there would be differences in the various abilities, techniques, methods, and concepts that were ultimately cultivated. In this way, different cultivation paths would naturally have differences in the extraordinary aspects that they were good at. Since there were differences, there would be relative advantages and disadvantages. This was unavoidable. Even the various cultivation paths themselves possessed the potential to be omnipotent. The various aspects that they covered were vast beyond imagination. However, as long as there were differences, there would definitely be advantages and disadvantages. It was clear that the cultivation path of this fourth tribulation expert was more effective than the cultivation path of other fourth tribulation experts in the aspect of reproduction. This kind of ability became an important bargaining chip for him to stay behind. The ability to reproduce the results of the sacrifice of the fourth tribulation experts was extremely important. After all, this kind of reproduction ability could reduce the possibility of deviation in the narration. Even if it could not be completely eliminated, being able to reduce it a little was a gain. For the many transcending experts outside, this was a huge chance of survival. With these 2 points, it was enough for him to become the last remaining fourth tribulation expert. Moreover, this fourth tribulation expert was quite popular. This increased his chances of staying by a few more points. If he was popular, he would naturally gain the recognition of more fourth tribulation experts. In the final selection process, it was naturally easier for him to be excluded from the list of sacrifices. Thus, he was the one who stayed behind in the end. At this moment, this fourth tribulation expert reappeared in the world created by the endless tribulations of the world. He appeared in front of the many transcending experts. Although hundreds of millions of years had passed in the secret realm, only a few years had passed in the outside world. For ordinary people, these few years were naturally not a short period of time. However, for these transcending experts, even the ones with the lowest cultivation, the despair realm, this amount of time was essentially no different than the blink of an eye. He's the only one left. When they saw that only one fourth tribulation expert remained, the many transcending experts felt an indescribable sadness. It had to be known that the number of fourth tribulation experts who had entered the secret realm before was counted in the millions. But now, out of so many fourth tribulation powerhouses, only one was left. The rest of the fourth tribulation powerhouses didn't appear in the endless world outside this world at all. In the eyes of the many transcending experts, there was no need to mention their fates. Under such circumstances, how could they not feel a stirring emotion when they knew why these fourth tribulation experts chose to sacrifice themselves? In fact, most of the transcending experts suddenly felt that their lives had become much heavier. It was as if they had taken on many responsibilities that they did not have before. The fourth tribulation expert did not care about the complicated feelings of the many transcending experts. At this moment, he unhesitatingly used his reappearance ability. It was as if he had suddenly turned into a world, and everything that had happened in the secret realm was replayed in a time-accelerated manner. During this process, words that seemed soft but possessed unimaginable penetrative power were constantly transmitted into the ears of the many transcending experts, deeply imprinting themselves in their hearts. Is this how they sacrifice themselves? At this moment, the same thought flashed through the minds of all the transcending experts. For a moment, all of them felt an indescribable sourness in their hearts. That heavy feeling became even more intense. The voices that were constantly echoing in the ears of these transcendent experts were the countless details of how to cultivate after choosing a path, the countless obstacles that needed to be considered in the process of cultivating that path, and the countless ways that could be used to reach the end of that path. The content of this narration, combined with the scene of the fourth tribulation expert's reappearance, made the many transcending experts feel that their understanding of cultivation and the path they had chosen were constantly improving. In a daze, they even felt as if they were listening to an indescribably grand speech. They felt as if their very essence was rising in an unimaginable manner. In fact, there were even those in despair who brazenly broke through their limits and became supreme emperors. Similarly, there were also supreme emperors who directly broke through their limits and became tribulation experts. Of course, he had only reached this step. Breaking through to the tribulation realm was much more difficult than breaking through before. Even though this was a description of the path between the fifth and sixth tribulations, it still brought many benefits to the transcending experts who were above tribulation experts. However, they still lacked a crucial opportunity to truly push these tribulation experts past their bottlenecks and break through their limits. Therefore, although many tribulation experts were able to improve in the end, not a single one of them truly broke through. Although only a few years had passed in the outside world, what happened in the secret realm spanned hundreds of millions of years. Under such circumstances, even if the fourth tribulation expert sped up, even if he skipped over all the meaningless things that happened in the secret plane, it would still take several decades for him to recreate everything that had happened in the secret plane, and for him to analyze the method of passing through that path in detail. Now that this path has been completely cleared, everyone can choose this path without many side effects. We have done everything we can. What happens next is up to everyone. The fourth tribulation expert finally ended his narration with these words. As he finished his narration, the mystic realm that he had recreated disappeared. His figure also reappeared in this world. Then, without any hesitation, he took a step forward and merged into the void in the blink of an eye. He directly turned into the path in the void that they had been exploring for hundreds of millions of years. As he stepped onto the path, he felt that he had suddenly broken through his limits. He stood at a bottleneck that he had been unable to break through for countless years. He had broken through the realm barrier that he had been unable to break through for countless years. Is this how they feel? No wonder every path they choose is so strange. This thought flashed through the fourth tribulation expert's mind. Previously, he had been secretly wondering why those experts who had undergone the fourth tribulation seemed to have obtained some kind of unimaginable benefit after setting foot on this path. No matter how worried or fearful they were before, they would suddenly become happy and enlightened at this moment. It was as if they would not have any regrets, even if they were to die right there and then. Only now did he know that this was the feeling of stepping on this path. There was actually such an incredible feeling of sublimation. Under this feeling of ascension, all the worries, fears, and bewilderment from before seemed to be nothing. Of course, this was only a momentary feeling. Almost any cultivator who could reach this step would more or less have the mentality of being able to learn the Tao in the morning and die in the evening. However, those who were willing to accept the fate of death upon discovering the Tao were only a minority among the minority. In the end, the fear of death and the fear of losing everything that one cared about couldn't be suppressed so easily by the joy of comprehending the Tao. It was precisely because of this that this joy was quickly suppressed by all sorts of fear. Their expressions and emotions would naturally become inexplicably strange because of this. Strangeness that was mixed with joy and fear. Sighing, the fourth tribulation expert began to slowly walk towards the end of this path according to the method that the other fourth tribulation experts had explored before. This time, he didn't slow down, and he didn't analyze everything he had experienced to the other transcendence like he did in the secret realm. The reason for this was very simple. It was because the transcendent beings did not have the time to wait for him to slowly explain the entire process of cultivation. After all, this was not a mystic realm. The flow of time here is normal. Even if he had already understood the entire process of cultivation and only needed to continue advancing according to what he had explored before, the time needed was not something that could be covered by 100 or even 1,000 years. That was at least 10,000 or even 100,000 years. Obviously, for the transcendent beings, they could delay it for a few years, a few decades, or even a few centuries. However, it was clearly impossible for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. After all, they were in the midst of a tribulation. In this tribulation, everything they did had to be tested by the endless tribulations of the world. Could the endless tribulations of the world make them completely choose the path and let them continue to be in a daze? This was something that everyone knew was impossible. Without enough time and not being able to hear the entire cultivation process, it was better not to listen at all. Chapter 31:97. Because he knew this, the 4 tribulation powerhouse was just like the 6 tribulation powerhouses from before. He only cultivated without saying a word. Faced with such a situation, the numerous transcendent beings naturally focused their attention on all the changes that were happening to his body and everything related to the path that he had revealed. In the past few years, the content transmitted by the 4th tribulation powerhouse and the scenes reproduced made all the transcendent beings understand the entire process of passing the endless trials of the world's tribulations. Thus, even though they had yet to put it into practice, just in theory, they were already not much weaker than the 4th tribulation powerhouse. It could be said that on this path from the 5th tribulation to the 6th tribulation, every single one of them could be considered a powerhouse who spoke the loudest. Under such circumstances, even though this 4th tribulation expert did not say anything, everything he did was clearly seen by all the transcending experts, and they understood it very well. It was also able to match up with what the 4th tribulation expert had said earlier. This caused the supreme transcendence to finally relax. The 4th tribulation experts had paid such a huge price and sacrificed so much in order to obtain these things. However, the transcendent experts still had some doubts in their hearts. This kind of thing seemed very exaggerated, but in fact, it was human nature. Anyone would still have some doubts about something that they had not personally witnessed. Not to mention that every single one of these transcending experts had experienced countless trials, plotted against each other, schemed against each other, and schemed against each other. Even though they seemed to be at the bottom of this world and were existences that the 4th tribulation powerhouses did not think highly of, that was only what it seemed like. In fact, in any part of the world, these transcendent transcendents could be said to be the most outstanding ones. It was clear that it would not be easy for any of them to achieve anything in this world. It could be said that if any of them wrote down their experiences, it would be a legendary epic. Thus, they would instinctively be vigilant and suspicious of everything. Even though they were shocked and moved by the sacrifice of those 4th tribulation cultivators, they couldn't help but be vigilant and suspicious. Only when the 4th tribulation powerhouse truly followed the method he had described and the appearance he had reappeared to advance towards the end of the path, towards the peak, did they completely dispel the subtle suspicions hidden in the bottom of their hearts. Or rather, they had enough reason to convince their own instincts. Just as the 4th tribulation expert had thought, these transcendent experts clearly didn't have much time to stay here and watch the entire process of the 4th tribulation expert advancing on the path. At this moment, after watching the cultivation process of the 4th tribulation powerhouse for a while, they had no choice but to choose the path chosen by the 4th tribulation powerhouse one by one under the urging of some mysterious channel in their hearts. They also began to step on that path. Of course, during this process, there were naturally some stubborn people who insisted on choosing other paths. There were also some who felt that they were smarter than any other 4th tribulation powerhouse, or felt that they understood themselves better than any other 4th tribulation powerhouse, and knew what the path was most suitable for them. Thus, they chose other methods or other paths. After all, who knew how many transcendent beings there were? Naturally, there were all sorts of weirdos. Even if there was only one weirdo among the hundreds of millions of transcendent beings, or only one who didn't follow the crowd due to various reasons, In this world, the total number of such existences added up to an extremely large number. Because of that, as soon as they began to choose their paths and attempt to walk them, the entire world became very lively. In the end, almost every single path was chosen by a transcendent cultivator. The entire world seemed to be lively like 100 flowers blooming, not the slightest bit monotonous. On the path, the fifth tribulation powerhouses in the void began to become nervous. Compared to before, the number of fifth tribulation powerhouses in the void had increased by more than 10 times. It was also very lively. As for the reason, it was naturally because the fourth tribulation powerhouses who chose to sacrifice themselves and chose their paths had already ascended to fifth tribulation powerhouses. They had also fulfilled the requirements of the endless tribulations of the world, condensed their own path, and were directly sealed in this void. There are actually so many people who don't believe us. A fifth tribulation powerhouse side. Isn't that to be expected? There are so many people. How can everyone think the same way? Another fifth tribulation powerhouse consoled. Although we know this, we have sacrificed so much, yet they directly ignored our sacrifices. Another fifth tribulation powerhouse side. It doesn't matter if they don't believe us. We have already done our best. Now, what happens to them is up to them. Our mission is already completed. Another fifth tribulation powerhouse said. The fifth tribulation powerhouses who spoke were obviously those who had just become fifth tribulation powerhouses. And the reason why they had the time and energy to chat here was naturally because they could be said to be at ease right now. They were not like the fourth tribulation powerhouse with boundless potential who was the first to become a fifth tribulation powerhouse. They had successfully walked the path. Because they had successfully walked the path, they had fulfilled the requirements of the endless tribulations of the world. Their world had not suffered any damage because of this. And this also meant that they did not need to bear the burden of the entire world's consciousness. And since they did not need to bear this burden, they naturally did not need to fall into a state of deep sleep. Naturally, they could naturally have the time and energy to chat here. Of course, this was also because the transcendent transcendents who had walked the path they had condensed could not pose a threat to them, so they had the mood to chat here. Otherwise, they would have started to nervously and inexplicably start to sublimate their own path, working hard to surpass the transcendent transcendents who had walked their path, so that they would not lose their last bit of vitality. Suddenly, a fifth tribulation powerhouse sighed. As expected, he failed. Why bother? It was because the transcendent transcendents who had created the path he had condensed had unexpectedly failed at this moment. Both he and his world had suffered the backlash of the path. His body and soul had been destroyed, and his world had completely collapsed. Only an empty shell was left. This situation made people sigh at his overestimation, but there was nothing else. And for the other transcendent transcendents, although it could not be said to be like a bucket of cold water being poured over their heads, it still made them feel a little more clear-headed, and they began to examine their previous decisions more carefully. With this kind of examination, many of them finally changed their minds and began to follow the crowd, following the other transcendent transcendents to step onto the path chosen by the fourth tribulation powerhouses. Of course, this was only a part of it. As mentioned before, iron-headed people were everywhere, no matter what level they were at. This was true even for the transcendent transcendents. Not to mention the fact that someone had failed in front of them. Even if they themselves had failed, they would still make the same choice if they had a choice. They would only feel that their choice was correct and that there was no problem. The reason why they had failed before was only because of bad luck, bad timing, unsuitable environment, and so on. In short, it was not their own problem, nor was it a problem of their own choice. It was all a problem of the outside world. In this case, it was not surprising that they would make such a decision at this time. Even if the fifth tribulation powerhouses were standing in front of them, they would not be able to stop them. Moreover, they had already become competitors and could not communicate with each other at all. Naturally, it was even more impossible to do anything to them. Time slowly passed, and before they knew it, tens of thousands of years had passed. This period of time was nothing to the transcendent transcendents. For the fifth tribulation powerhouses who were already in the void, this period of time was like the blink of an eye compared to the hundreds of millions of years they had spent in the secret realm. As for the transcendent transcendents who had not entered the secret realm, this period of time was much longer than the several years they had waited. However, this was only relative to the time they had spent waiting. To them, this period of time was nothing more than a small, insignificant part of their cultivation process that spanned billions of years. Naturally, it was also nothing. However, although time was nothing to them, it did not mean that they felt that everything that had happened in the past tens of thousands of years was nothing. In fact, during these tens of thousands of years, the transcendent transcendents felt that the changes in their surroundings had completely exceeded their imagination. Almost every once in a while, there would be transcendent transcendents who they were familiar with who would perish because they had failed in their attempts to walk the path. Watching those who could normally live for eternity, watching those worlds that once possessed great potential and might even be thousands of times more powerful than they were now vanishing every once in a while, it was naturally a great thrill for these transcendents. After all, they were essentially no different from the transcendent transcendents who had failed. Since those transcendent transcendents could fall into such a fate, then they could also fall into the same fate at any time. In this way, they would naturally have some kind of mentality of mourning for the death of the rabbit. The failure of every transcendent transcendence would almost always make them think about what their own failure would be like. With this mentality, tens of thousands of years seemed especially long to these transcendent transcendents. Even an ordinary few 100 million years would not feel as long as these tens of thousands of years. Those failed transcendents were not limited to those who had their own ideas, who had chosen other paths, and who had chosen other methods to tread that path. Although it was true that they had suffered great losses, many of the transcendent transcendents who had chosen the right path and believed in the results of the sacrifices of the fourth tribulation experts had also failed. Knowing it and being able to do it were two different things. For the vast majority of transcendents, this path was still too profound. It should be known that this was the path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation. Not even the fourth tribulation experts were qualified to step on this path, let alone the transcendent transcendents who hadn't even reached the tribulation realm. To them, this path was simply a path above the clouds. They couldn't even see this path clearly. Even if they had been sent on this path by the endless tribulations of the world, even if they knew the trajectory of this path, because of the sacrifices of the fourth tribulation experts, they knew many details of this path. However, their realm determined that no matter what they did, they couldn't see this path clearly. In fact, it was impossible for them to even see this path. In this way, walking on the path was equivalent to blindfolding them, blocking their ears, and even completely cutting off their sense of touch. It was as if they were walking on this path that floated in the void, and a single misstep would cause them to fall into a bottomless abyss. The level of danger was self-evident. Even if the transcendent transcendents were trying to walk this path, it was normal for them to make mistakes in such a situation. After all, although it was a comparison of the path above the clouds, the complexity and difficulty of this path was many times greater than the path above the clouds. In other words, the difficulty of this path for the transcendent transcendents was as great as the difficulty of the path above the clouds for ordinary people. That was why things had turned out like this. Those who had transcended clearly knew every step and every detail. They had even simulated themselves walking this path countless times in their hearts. But when they finally stepped on this path, they still stumbled and made mistakes that they couldn't make up for and fell on the way. Chapter 3198. Whether it was the fourth or sixth tribulation experts, although they felt regretful for these transcendent experts who had fallen halfway on their path, they didn't feel that there was anything wrong with it. After all, their levels were too low when it came to the path from the five tribulation to the sixth tribulation. Even if all the conditions, environment, and opportunities were built, they still had to walk on their own. At their level, it wouldn't be surprising if any of them were to die on the way. While these transcendents were painstakingly working on how to walk on the path, In the mysterious place between the endless world and the endless world, Luo Fan's incarnation had shifted his attention from these transcendents to another existence. That was the endless world itself. The reason for this was very simple. It was because when the true path from 5 to 6 tribulations was born, the transformation that happened in the endless world was more profound than what those who had transcended could imagine, and the effects were even more profound. In the eyes of those transcendents, the emergence of the true path seemed to make the endless world more complete and get rid of some subtle shackles. However, for Luo Fan, who could sense all the changes in the endless world, he clearly knew that the influence of this transformation had spread across all aspects of the endless world. Whether it was the quality of the endless world itself or the level of the creatures in it, they all received an indescribable improvement in the process. This improvement might not be very big, but the impact was extremely far-reaching. It made everything in the endless world truly comparable to the 6th level of the Tao Master's path outside the endless world. Faintly, the barrier of heaven and earth that originally enveloped the endless world, or rather, the countless islands that had vaguely reached the level of perfect world, seemed to have received some kind of indescribable enhancement at this time, but also seemed to have suddenly weakened by many times, but it was no longer just a kind of absolute strength and firmness like before. Instead, it was in a strange state that seemed to be extremely powerful, but also extremely weak. It seemed to be extremely firm, but also extremely fragile. This strange state made the endless world, or the countless islands, even more guarded against a certain existence, and it became more difficult to pass through. However, it was completely open to the other existence. Not only did it no longer obstruct it, it even seemed as if it was taking the initiative to absorb it. In the face of this situation, the 6 tribulation powerhouses outside the island branches all began to become excited. Evidently, the changes to the heavenly barrier had allowed them to see hope. He saw the hope of participating in the internal changes of the many island branches at this moment. As for why they were so concerned about the internal situation of this island branch, the reason was simple. It was because another change had occurred in this island branch. This kind of change was none other than its appearance. It wasn't the appearance of the many layers of the void sea, but the appearance of the entire void sea that was above the countless layers of the void sea. In the past, these islands had only been the shadow of an island floating above the sea of nothingness. And now, after a series of metamorphoses, the island was no longer just an illusion. It had truly turned from an illusion to reality, from an illusion to an island that was a physical existence. At this moment, the countless island branches above the void sea, or rather, the endless world had already reflected an island shrouded in fog. This island was surrounded by fog, making it very blurry and difficult to see clearly. If an ordinary person saw this fog, they would probably think that it was just ordinary fog. However, if any 6 tribulation powerhouse paid attention to this island and the fog, they would discover that the essence of the fog was actually the fusion of the countless island branches. The trembling and changing of the smoke was essentially the result of the various subtle changes that happened to the countless islands during this process. Although the countless island branches all branched off from the same island, if one traced back to the source, all the island branches came from the same source. However, even if they came from the same source, after a long period of development, they had already become very different. This was the case whether it was on the inside or on the outside. In this way, the appearance of the island branches reflected on the outside would naturally be different. In other words, the outline and terrain of the island formed would also be different. And only when the islands formed by the countless island branches were stacked together would they become the island that appeared above the entire void sea. As a result, the island in front of them was formed. The common characteristics of the island branches became the main body of the island, becoming the part that had become real and no longer illusory. The difference between them was that they affected each other and interfered with each other. In the end, they directly formed the fog that enveloped the island. It was a fog that no 6 tribulation expert could penetrate with their perception. They would definitely be blocked by the fog. This change was quite unexpected for both Luo Fan and the many six tribulation powerhouses. However, they also clearly knew the significance of this change to the endless world and the countless islands that branched off from it. With such a real island, the endless world and the countless island branches could be considered to have truly laid a foundation for the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. In the past, the endless world had become a kind of natural landscape on the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road and had broken away from the limitations of man-made objects. But in fact, even at this time, its essence was still quite weak. Among the countless natural landscapes on the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road, its position was still at the bottom. Perhaps a single change would be enough to completely destroy these countless branches of the island. However, it was clear that when the countless island branches truly appeared above the entire void sea, the situation was completely different. At this moment, it was clear that there was already a portion of the countless islands that had completely surpassed the countless layers of the void sea. Moreover, such an existence that reigned over the endless layers of the void ocean was a trait shared by countless islands and branches. In this way, no matter what happened in the void sea, even if they were all destroyed, there would still be a part of the island branches. The common characteristics of all the island branches would not be affected. After all, this part of the common characteristics was already above the void sea. Naturally, no matter how the void sea changed, it would not be affected. In this way, the endless world was immune to most of the changes in the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. And this was only a small part of the natural landscapes on the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. In other words, with this change, the endless world had already surpassed a large part of the natural landscapes on the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road and stood at the forefront of the natural landscapes. The magnitude of this improvement could be imagined. And how could the endless world suddenly have such a huge improvement not attract the attention of the six tribulation experts? If it was in the past, only those six tribulation experts who noticed that the countless island branches were man-made objects transformed into natural objects would notice the uniqueness of these island branches. Therefore, they were eager to enter the island branches to explore the secrets within. But now, any six tribulation expert could feel the uniqueness of the island branches, feel its mysteries, and thus yearn to enter it. After all, although the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road had countless natural landscapes and cultivation places. However, among them, there were only a few who could truly stand in the front row and at the very front. Moreover, almost all of these natural sceneries and cultivation places had existed since the birth of the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. They had not changed in the past billions of years, and some might even have not developed much. Under such circumstances, the sudden appearance of a place that had just completed its transformation and was able to stand in the front row and stand above most of the natural landscapes was self-evident to those six tribulation powerhouses. Therefore, at this time, the number of six tribulation experts around the many island branches was many times more than what they had seen before. The increase in the number of six tribulation powerhouses increased the attraction of these islands to six tribulation powerhouses, thus forming a cycle that was unknown whether it was good or bad. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was between the endless world and the endless world, did not notice the six tribulation experts outside the island branches. It was as if he wasn't paying attention to the numerous transcendents who were struggling in the boundless world. At this moment, he was working hard to achieve a goal. This goal was none other than to descend on the island above the ocean of nothingness. That island was condensed from the common characteristics of countless island branches, while Luo Fan seemed to be in the midst of countless island branches at the same time, and also seemed to be above them. There is a certain degree of similarity between the two, and this degree of similarity made it possible for Luo Fan to descend on the island and change his state to that of the island. Although the two states were quite similar, in fact, Luo Fan's current state was more like a rootless duckweed. Although it seemed incomparably mysterious and elusive, although it seemed incomparably mysterious and difficult to grasp, It was actually just a state that combined himself with the countless island branches. In comparison, the current state of the island was much more stable. Compared to his current state of rootless duckweed, the island now seemed to be deeply rooted in the ground and could withstand a storm that was thousands of times stronger than his current state. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan naturally needed to change his state from a rootless duckweed to a state that was deeply rooted in the ground. Moreover, his figure could not be condensed above the entire ocean of nothingness, but the convergence of the island's branches could be condensed above the entire ocean of nothingness. This was enough to show which state was more suitable for the sixth level of the Tao Master's Path. What was the sixth level of the Tao Master's Path? The sixth level of the Tao Master's Path was for the six tribulation experts to better cultivate and to build a solid foundation for the six tribulation experts to step into the seventh tribulation realm. In such a place, all the rules were clearly in service of this goal. In other words, the sixth level of the Tao Master's Path was definitely helpful to achieve that goal. In this way, between the current state of the island and the state in which Luo Fan's incarnation was in, there was no need to say which one was more beneficial for his cultivation. Luo Fan might have been a little confused about this at the beginning, but now he was very clear about it. Therefore, when he saw an opportunity, he naturally would not let it go. Compared to this opportunity, the struggles of the transcendence experts in the endless world and the expectations and doubts of the six tribulation experts outside the island branches were naturally insignificant. Although his state was quite similar to the state of the island, it was still different. Otherwise, it would be impossible for him to appear above the ocean of nothingness without leaving a trace. Hence, it was not an easy task to break through the barrier between the two and truly transform into a state similar to that of the island and truly descend onto the island. At this time, Luo Fan did not take action in a hurry. Instead, he focused all his attention on the island and began to infiltrate it from all aspects, trying to find out all the secrets of the island. This island was above all the island branches, but it was also incomparably closely related to all the island branches. It felt like the countless branches of the islands were like countless pillars supporting the sky, supporting the island, and making it stand above everything else. In other words, the island branches felt like the root, and this island was like the fruit that grew on the root. An incomparably wonderful and mysterious fruit. Perhaps this can be called a kind of Tao fruit. At this time, such a thought suddenly flashed in Luo Fan's mind. Chapter 3199. When he thought the name Tao fruit, Luo Fan was suddenly enlightened. Tao fruit, Tao fruit, Tao fruit, Tao fruit, Tao fruit, Tao fruit, Tao fruit. Wasn't this island a Tao fruit? True saints were called chaos origin Tao fruits in some Tao of cultivation. This was only a theory. In fact, it seemed that those Tao of cultivation had a rather shallow understanding of true saints. However, to a certain extent, the name Chaos Origin Tao Fruit could be considered to have come into contact with the essence of true saints. Chaos Origin was the origin of chaos, or rather, the origin of chaos. Chaos Origin Tao Fruit was naturally a fruit born from the origin of chaos. Such an existence naturally possessed boundless power and unimaginable characteristics. It surpassed time, space, matter, energy, and even everything that was tangible and intangible. It surpassed all imaginations, thoughts, guesses, and measurements. This was obviously similar to a true saint. To a certain extent, it was still accurate to say that it was the same as a true saint. From this, one could see the profoundness of Tao fruits. At this moment, although this island was still worlds apart from the legendary Chaos Origin Tao fruit, it still possessed some characteristics similar to Chaos Origin Tao fruit. However, in the end, it still possessed a special characteristic similar to a primordial Chaos Tao fruit. It was similarly a fruit formed from the convergence of some sort of indescribable Tao. It similarly possessed the characteristics of standing above everything, stabilizing everything, suppressing everything, transcending everything, and supporting everything. It was also a fruit formed from some indescribable Tao. It also possessed the characteristics of being above everything, stabilizing everything, suppressing everything, transcending everything, and supporting everything. Perhaps this can be called Division Tao fruit? At this moment, such a thought suddenly flashed through Luo Fan's mind. After discovering that this might be some sort of Tao fruit, he felt that his train of thought had been directly opened. In the past, he couldn't truly see through or even define the countless mysterious principles. At this moment, he seemed to have found the root and could see the veins. The root and the veins clearly converged on the Tao of division. Now, this Tao of division had clearly developed to a certain limit. In the end, this Tao of division formed this Tao fruit above the void ocean. As such, this Tao fruit could be called Division Tao fruit. As a Tao fruit that Luo Fan had defined, it naturally had an essential difference from ordinary Tao of cultivation. Compared to an ordinary path of cultivation, its scope was billions of times wider. Although it was called Division Fruit of Ways, and it sounded like it was only related to division, in reality, it clearly did not just contain simple division. Its scope could be said to be the limit of all imaginations. If it had to be said, it contained the division of all things that were involved in the imagination. In other words, what the Tao fruit splitting involved was not division, but the division of all things that reached the limits of one's imagination. The difference between the two was that pure differentiation was just a change. Perhaps this kind of change could be researched into a flower and expanded countless times, but in the end, it was just a change. As for the latter, it contained the division of all things, so it was obviously different. That was everything that was involved in differentiation. All the principles, all the mysteries, and all the mysteries were contained within. One was just a type of change, while the other encompassed all possibilities and everything. It was easy to imagine just how big the difference between the two was. At this moment, the island was clearly the division defined by the second situation. At this moment, Luo Fan guarded the division Tao fruit in front of him with his mind. He seemed to have broken through some kind of barrier. With a jolt of his body and mind, he had already arrived on the island silently. However, he had easily broken through the barrier between his clone and the island, which he had originally planned to spend a lot of effort to break through. The root of all of this was that he had firmly believed that the island before him was a Tao fruit. Such a change clearly proved a fact. That was, his understanding and the essence of the island were quite compatible. Only such a compatible understanding could break through the barrier that should have taken a lot of effort to break through, and only then could he directly descend onto the island. The moment he descended onto the island, he suddenly felt that the essence of his clone seemed to have been strengthened to a certain extent. This strengthening of the essence allowed him to lock onto the location of his main body. It was no longer like before, where he could only rely on the invisible and subtle connection between his main body and his clone to determine exactly where his main body was. As he was able to lock onto the position of his main body, he was able to see where the other countless clones were, what state they were in, and what they were busy with. All of this was seen by him at this moment. This change meant that although his clone had not obtained independence, to a certain extent, its essence was only slightly inferior to his main body. To me, this is my heavens. To my main body, the heavens are the Tao fruits. At this moment, a deeper understanding surfaced in his heart. After defining the existence of the Tao fruits, he understood that his heavens were actually similar to the island in front of him in essence. In fact, they could be considered some sort of Tao fruits. However, the division Tao fruit was constantly dividing from an island, or rather, it was constantly dividing from the layers of heaven and earth. In the end, it followed another concept and gathered into a Tao fruit in another form. The heavens were different. It relied on advancing from the Tao Master's path, advancing layer by layer, and finally forming a Tao fruit on the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. From the point of view of a true saint as a primordial chaos Tao fruit, the heavens could actually be considered the embryonic form of a primordial chaos Tao fruit. Although it might only have a billionth of the true primordial chaos Tao fruit's embryonic form, It was still the embryonic form of a primordial chaos Tao fruit. Although the division Tao fruit could already be considered a Tao fruit that had already taken shape, it was only a Tao fruit condensed from the division Tao. Compared to a true primordial chaos Tao fruit, its essence was clearly inferior by trillions of times. It was precisely because of this that the two were roughly on the same level. This was also why Luo Fan's clone, who was supported by the division Tao fruit, could obtain such a qualitative improvement. At this moment, Luo Fan stopped what he was doing and began to carefully sense everything that was happening to his clone. However, the sudden improvement of the clone's essence made him feel a certain bad possibility. If that's the case, if this Tao fruit is a little stronger, won't it be able to surpass the heavens? If that's the case, with the support of this Tao fruit, will the clone be able to surpass the main body? The clone will become the main body, and the main body will become the clone instead? This worry involuntarily emerged from the bottom of his heart. This kind of worry sounded very logical. Anyone who was in Luo Fan's state would inevitably have this kind of worry. There was no doubt about this. Therefore, at this moment, he had to carefully sense everything about this clone and weigh the probability of this possibility happening. After a period of comprehension, he breathed a sigh of relief. Although this possibility was not impossible, it was actually quite small. In the end, there was still a chasm between the main body and the clone. It was not difficult for the clone to become independent, as long as the main body completely severed all the connections between the clone and the main body. However, if the clone wanted to surpass the main body, the difficulty would obviously skyrocket by millions of times. After all, the connection between the clone and the main body was already unimaginably tight. Under this connection, the main body would also be able to obtain the corresponding benefits if the clone made any progress. In other words, if the clone improved, the main body would also have a corresponding improvement. Perhaps the improvement wouldn't be as great as the clone, but it would definitely be there. Moreover, compared to the clone, the main body's improvement might be more fundamental, more intrinsic, and more difficult to shake. Under what circumstances could the clone surpass the main body? Obviously, the clone's improvement would be so fast that the main body couldn't even react. Before the main body could completely absorb the improvement that the clone transmitted through the connection, the clone would have already surpassed the main body and replaced the main body, causing the main body to become the clone instead. Under such circumstances, the clone could turn from guest to host. However, it was clear that the probability of this happening was far too small. It was so small that it could only happen if the clone directly obtained a mixed origin Tao fruit and directly obtained a Tao fruit that surpassed the Tao fruit that the main body possessed. Obviously, if it was so easy to obtain a mixed origin Tao fruit or a Tao fruit that surpassed the Tao fruit that the main body possessed, then Luo Fan wouldn't be at his current realm. He would have probably become a true saint long ago and obtained a mixed origin Tao fruit. As long as this wasn't the case, then the clone's gains would definitely not be faster than the main body's. After all, although the clone had everything that the main body had, it was still fundamentally weaker than the main body. The difference in essence meant that the main body would definitely be able to obtain more benefits than the clone. As for why it always seemed like the clone had obtained gains before transmitting it to the main body, this was because the clone had always been under the main body's absolute control. It seemed like only the clone was cultivating and the clone was fighting, but in reality, the main body and the clone were cultivating and fighting at the same time. This was why it seemed like the clone had obtained it first and then transmitted it to the main body. At this time, after carefully understanding the situation of this incarnation, Luo Fan was completely relieved. He no longer worried that his incarnation would turn from guest to host, turning his main body into the incarnation and turning the incarnation into the main body. As soon as he relaxed, he couldn't help but be immersed in the indescribable mysterious feeling that the clone transmitted to him. At this moment, the clone standing on the island seemed to be standing above everything else. The boundless world was instantly taken in by his eyes. Every continent, every ocean, every island, and even every living creature was instantly reflected in his eyes. This seems somewhat similar to before, but it was essentially a different situation. Previously, he could sense everything in the endless world, including all the continents, all the oceans, all the islands, and all the living creatures. However, that was only because of his senses. In reality, his eyes couldn't see everything at all. It was only because his senses were strong enough that everything seemed to be happening directly before his eyes. However, the current situation was completely different. At this moment, everything was happening before his eyes. He was relying on his own eyes to directly see everything, discover everything, and grasp everything. In this state, he only needed to focus his eyes slightly, and he would be able to see clearly and understand things that he would need to expend a lot of his perception in the past. Moreover, with just a single thought, his eyes would be able to see through the river of time in the various worlds. He could vaguely wander in it at will, as if he could change everything that had happened in the past just by waving his hand. This is what it means to truly grasp the endless world. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly had a realization. Although his authority in the endless world had almost been squeezed out by the overall potential consciousness of the person who had transcended, it was already somewhat insufficient for him to rely on his authority to grasp and influence the endless world. However, at this moment, he felt that his control over the endless world had reached a peak, an unprecedented, supreme peak. In the past, even if he had the authority of the endless world, he had only grasped the endless world's present and future. But now, he had even completely grasped the endless world's past. However, there were countless shadows in the past. Those shadows were densely packed and vaguely enveloped the endless world's past. What pity! If only I had been less involved in the past. At this moment, he couldn't help but feel a little regretful. He only needed to sense slightly to know what those shadows were. They were clearly the influence that his past self had on the endless world. Every bit of influence was a bit of a shadow. The stronger the influence, the deeper and denser the shadow. Evidently, with his past actions when he had the authority of the endless world, it was normal for him to create such a shadow that enveloped the endless world's past. Chapter 3200. However, the closer this shadow was to the present, the thinner it became. After all, his control over the endless world had recently been squeezed to almost nothing by the consciousness of those who had transcended. Under such circumstances, his control over the endless heaven and earth had naturally weakened to the point where it was almost non-existent. As a result, the shadow that shrouded this period of time had become much thinner. The thinner shadow allowed Luo Fan to influence the past of that period of time to a certain extent. He could even change it completely. This situation was naturally very different from the common perception of time. After all, according to the common perception of time, the past was eternal and the future was limitless. Under such circumstances, wanting to change the past seemed to be an impossible task. However, it was clear that this perception of time was only a perception. Perhaps it seemed to be correct in most situations and was treated as the absolute truth. But in the end, it was still not the truth. It was just a perception. Since it was only a perception, it could naturally be correct, but could also be wrong. Even the correct perception had its scope of application. Within the scope of application, it was actually correct. However, if it exceeded the scope of application, it would naturally be wrong. It was clear that the relationship between Luo Fan's clone and the endless world was clearly not within the scope of the common perception of time. Therefore, at this moment, the past of the endless world could already be changed by him. With a thought, the clone of Luo Fan from hundreds of thousands of years ago trembled slightly and suddenly connected with his future self. In an instant, he possessed all the memories and comprehensions from the future. I see. After understanding this, the clone of Luo Fan trembled slightly, and a look of understanding appeared in his eyes as he muttered. Immediately after, he took action and stretched out his hand to point at a certain part of the world. With this point of his finger, that part of the world instantly underwent an earth-shattering change. Originally, This part of the world was not a small world that had been developed and transformed by those who had transcended. It was just an ordinary world that those who had transcended had opened up in order to expand their islands. This kind of world occupied the majority of the endless world. Such a world would not have attracted any attention in the past. In fact, not even the creator of this world, the transcendent being, would have noticed the existence of this world. At this moment, as Luo Fan's actions from hundreds of thousands of years ago, the world instantly underwent various indescribable changes. All sorts of indescribable mysteries were born out of thin air. Even the living beings in the world were endowed with various qualities that they did not have before, qualities that were extremely compatible with the path of cultivation. Hundreds of thousands of years was only an extremely short period of time compared to the time scale of this endless world. This amount of time was not even enough for this world to give birth to a transcendent being. However, to mortals, a few 100,000 years was an extremely long period of time. It was so long that this special trait that Luo Fan had bestowed upon him was enough to completely merge into the depths of the lives of all living beings in this world. At this moment, Luo Fan's body trembled slightly. He suddenly felt that there were many memories that he did not have before in his heart. Sure enough, the past has really been changed. In an instant, he understood the essence of the incarnation's ability to change the past in the fruit of the way. At this moment, the new memories that emerged in his heart came from not long ago. Even if the island branch was completely isolated from the outside world of the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, and the timelines inside and outside did not affect each other, it did not mean that the island branch or the time within the endless world had nothing to do with the outside world. No matter what, compared to the outside world, the island branch or the endless world had only appeared for a short period of time. Under such circumstances, no matter how much time was turned back, no matter how much time was pushed forward, it was obviously impossible to push back to a period of time before this. Therefore, even if Luo Fan's incarnation pushed back the timeline hundreds of thousands of years ago, it was only a short period of time for his body. At this time, these new memories that appeared out of thin air came from the different development of the endless world in the past hundreds of thousands of years. For all living beings in the endless world, this new development was the true history of the endless world in the past hundreds of thousands of years. However, for Luo Fan, he could clearly feel the difference between this new history and the history of the past. Because for him, both kinds of history existed in his heart. He was able to directly compare these two kinds of memories, the similarities and differences between the two histories. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that although Luo Fan's changes to the past had a profound impact, it was still only the past hundreds of thousands of years ago, and the scope of the impact was still quite limited for the endless world as a whole. Perhaps at this time, it was not only him who realized that the past had been changed, but all the 6 tribulation experts who had thrown their incarnations into the endless world. After all, the reason why Luo Fan's incarnation could change the past was because it was already in the fruit of the way. However, the fruit of the way was completely supported by the endless world. Under such circumstances, the ability to change the past could only be limited to the endless world. Thus, for the 6 tribulation experts whose true bodies were not in the endless world, their true bodies would naturally not be affected by this change. However, it was clear that their incarnations were in the endless world, so their incarnations would naturally be affected by this change. This contradiction between being unaffected and being affected meant that their true bodies would have both the memories before and after the change. At the same time, they would naturally know whether the past had been changed, and they would also know where the change had taken place. It was just like Luo Fan's true body. The reason why they couldn't detect it was because the new memories were no different from the old ones. When the two completely overlapped, it naturally felt like nothing had changed. But now, in the world constructed by the endless world tribulations, the transcendent experts suddenly discovered that there was a vitality that didn't belong to them. What's going on? Apart from us, what other living beings have the characteristics of transcendent? The transcendent experts who discovered these living beings were all dumbfounded. They had no idea what was going on. At this time, the six tribulation experts all felt that something was wrong. Why have these living beings appeared? That's right, I did feel that there was something wrong with this world. The same thought flashed through the minds of the six tribulation experts. Unfortunately, outside the endless world, or rather, outside the countless islands, there was an almost perfect world barrier that completely separated it from the outside world. Otherwise, they would have learned from their true bodies that the strange memories they had sensed before had only appeared out of thin air. The living beings that had appeared out of thin air were naturally the living beings that had been born from the world that Luo Fan had changed in the past. The reason why they had been sucked into the world created by the endless world tribulations like the transcendent experts was because Luo Fan had bestowed upon them a special characteristic that was extremely compatible with the path of cultivation. Because of this special characteristic, the endless world tribulations had overestimated them in this aspect. In the end, they were also qualified to be tested and receive the same treatment as the transcendent experts. At this time, the atmosphere in that world had undergone a subtle change. Many transcendents suddenly found traces of these strange creatures in their memories. The feeling of uneasiness in their hearts quickly faded away. They felt that everything was so normal, and they even began to feel strange about the things they had felt before. It's obviously normal, so why did I feel that they shouldn't have appeared? The transcendent experts were all rather puzzled. Along with this doubt, they began to feel a slight chill in their hearts. The reason for this was very simple. It was because they weren't the only ones who had felt that something was wrong. If it was just them, they could say that it was some kind of misconception. Although it was ridiculous to say that it was a misconception for existences like the transcendent experts, it was still an explanation. However, it was clear that they weren't the only ones who had felt that something was wrong. Previously, it was almost all the transcendent experts who had felt that something was wrong. They had also felt that these living beings shouldn't have existed. This situation clearly couldn't be explained by misconception. It couldn't be explained by misconception. At this time, they felt that this change was very normal, that everything was so natural, and that the feeling that something was wrong before was just an illusion. No matter how they looked at it, this situation wasn't right. No matter how they looked at it, there was a factor behind it that they couldn't understand. And this factor that they couldn't understand was clearly the source of their fear. This is the power of a Dao fruit. At this time, Luo Fan's expression suddenly became somewhat serious. At this time, he had only borrowed the power of a Dao fruit of division, which was who knew how many light years away from a Dao fruit of origin. Yet, it was already able to use such an inconceivable method to change the past of the endless world. Even the six tribulation experts couldn't resist or even detect it. Then, what about the real Dao fruit of origin? What kind of unimaginable power did a real Dao fruit of origin have? Could it also change the past? If so, how large would its range be? How high would the level of the cultivators it would affect? In fact, if one were to think about it, one's past and one's history had already been changed many times by those who possessed origin Dao fruits. Was the past in his memory the real past? Had everything that he had experienced been arranged in an extremely strict manner? As soon as he thought of this possibility, Luo Fan felt his breathing become heavy. After thinking for a long time, Luo Fan could only let out a long sigh in the end. The speculation about the Dao fruit of origin was essentially speculation about a true sage. Obviously, to him, thinking about these things was nothing more than making a fuss over nothing. Even if it was closely related to him, what could he do even if he thought it through? He still couldn't be immune to this change in the past, and he still couldn't even detect it. Next, how those who possessed Dao fruits of origin would deal with him would still be how they dealt with him, and how they could manipulate his past that would still be how they manipulated it. In this way, it was clearly meaningless to think about these things. After suppressing all these distracting thoughts, he began to study the various powers he possessed after condensing the Dao fruit of origin in greater detail. If he could change the past, then what about the future? Compared to the past, which was already certain, The future was obviously still uncertain and infinite. Therefore, changing the future was clearly meaningless for the present. Occupy. With a slight thought, Luo Fan thought of a word. He could manipulate and change the past, but for the future and the infinite possibilities of power, perhaps only the word occupy was meaningful. The future had infinite possibilities, and naturally, there were those that were beneficial to him, and those that were disadvantageous to him. Obviously, no matter how intelligent one was, it was impossible for things to develop according to one's wishes and for the future to become the possibility that one wanted. Under such circumstances, the best way to obtain the best future was naturally to expand one's current consciousness as much as possible into the various possibilities of the future, so that as many futures as possible could be connected to one's current self, so that no matter what possibilities there were, they would all be one's current self. As long as he could do this, he would naturally be able to take action in different futures, increasing the chances of success that were most beneficial to him. In the end, he would completely restrain them and turn them into the present and the future. In other words, he had to occupy countless future possibilities for himself in order to make everything develop to the greatest advantage for him. Chapter 32:01. When he thought of this, Luo Fan suddenly understood the direction of the Dao fruit's cultivation. Occupying the possibilities of the future was an almost infinite process in itself. This was because the possibilities of the future were endless. No matter how many possibilities there would definitely be other possibilities. As such, just this kind of cultivation that occupied the possibilities of the future was already an endless process of cultivation. However, this was clearly not the only way for the Dao fruit to improve. Occupying more possibilities of the future was just a method. In other words, it was just a method to guide the present of the future in a direction that was most beneficial to oneself. Perhaps this kind of cultivation was quite important, but a method was ultimately just a method. No matter how important a method was, it could not replace the goal. For the Dao fruit, the true goal of cultivation should be to help the essence of life and transcend everything. Only then could it be considered a cultivation goal. Obviously, the effect of occupying more futures was still a little lacking in this aspect. It wasn't good enough. As such, the Dao fruit's cultivation goal was obviously something else. To be able to descend into the past and occupy the future at will, in the end, it still belongs to the present. It's just that with the help of the Dao fruit, the present can surpass the limits of time and directly return to the past and head into the future. This way, if I want to improve myself and surpass the present, it is clearly a possible cultivation goal, Luo Fan's clone guessed. Surpass the present and allow oneself to be in the past, present, and future at the same time. Allow the past, present, and future to completely merge into one, only becoming different parts of oneself. It would no longer be like now, where they were of the same origin but were relatively independent. Compared to his current state, this was clearly a qualitative improvement. Once he reached this state, there would naturally be no distinction between the past, present, and future. At that time, even if another existence with the Dao fruit returned to the past and killed him, it would only be equivalent to an unimportant part of his body being destroyed. Not only would it not be fatal, but he could also completely recover in an instant if he wanted to. At this point, he would no longer have any flaws, but that was secondary. More importantly, the essence of his life had already completely surpassed time. Compared to before, it could be said to have obtained a qualitative improvement. This kind of cultivation was clearly possible for the current Luo Fan clone. However, it was a pity that his current Dao fruit was still just a divided Dao fruit. Compared to a true Chaos Origin Dao fruit, there was still an unimaginably huge gap. With the help of the split Dao fruit, even if Luo Fan cultivated it to the limit and completed his plan of fusing the past, present, and future into one, the scope of its effect would only be within this boundless world. In other words, it could only be used on this incarnation in this endless world. Moreover, because he did not completely immerse himself in the endless world, he did not experience the endless time like the living beings in the endless world. Instead, he was in a transcendent state, unaffected by the time. Therefore, the past he was involved in was just like the time when this endless world was born compared to the time in the outside world. Although such a fusion effect was quite mysterious, it was obviously many light years away from directly fusing everything from birth to the infinitely distant future. What a pity! No matter how open-minded Luo Fan was, he couldn't help but feel that it was a pity when he discovered this restriction. However, it was obvious that no matter how much he felt about it, this was a fact that could not be changed. Even if he could change the past and affect the future, the time period that this incarnation of his could be involved in could not exceed 100 million years. There was no other reason than that there was less than 100 million years left before his eighth tribulation. The time before the arrival of this great calamity was not measured by any objective time, but by the time that Luo Fan himself had spent to measure it. In other words, no matter how much time had passed in the outside world, even if it was only a moment, as long as any of Luo Fan's incarnations had spent enough time to reach the interval of the tribulation, his eighth tribulation would come instantly. Under such circumstances, even if he changed the past and let his past self directly integrate into the endless world, experiencing the endless time together with everything in the endless world, it would only be less than 100 million years before his eighth tribulation would come directly and pull him directly into it. He would then completely disappear from the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road and naturally disappear directly from this endless world. Once he disappeared from the boundless world, it would be doubtful if the fruit of division that he had condensed from the boundless world would still be effective. Since the Tao fruit division could not work, it naturally needed to be carefully considered whether his means of changing the past could continue to work. In this case, it was difficult to say what the final result would be. Therefore, even if he knew that he could not fully understand the mystery of the Tao fruit division because he had not integrated into the endless world, he could only sigh to himself and could not change it at all. This was the case for the past, and the situation was similar for the future. Although the endless world had passed the tribulation, it also suffered great damage and did not gain much benefit. But it was not completely defeated. The countless possibilities existed in the eyes of Luo Fan's clone at the same time. At this time, the countless possibilities were converging toward the present, turning from the countless possibilities into one certain fact, and then into the past, becoming an existence that could not be changed except for the existence that condensed the Tao fruit. It could be said that at every moment, there were countless possibilities completely annihilated and disappeared. From the perspective of time, it looked like an invisible giant serpent was constantly devouring countless futures to extend its own life. Before condensing the Tao fruit, even if Luo Fan saw all these possibilities, he could only adjust the present to affect the convergence of the possibilities and try his best to determine the possibility that he wanted in the future. Once he made a certain mistake at a certain moment, then things might become irreversible, and in the end, his future would be completely determined on the possibility that was not so perfect for him. However, it was clear that the situation was completely different now. For the current him, the situation was already many times more optimistic than before. After he condensed the Tao fruit, the past, present, and future were all under his influence at the same time. In this way, not only could he work hard to adjust his actions in the present to restrain the future to the possibility that he wanted, but he could also exert his strength and take action at the same time among the many possibilities in the past and future, working together to make the future choose the possibility that he wanted. The greatest significance of this change was that after this change, he already had the right to make mistakes. No matter how many times he made a wrong choice, as long as his Tao fruit still existed, he could change his choice in the past at will. Once, twice, thrice, or even countless times. It was very clear that this way, he would almost certainly be able to restrain the future to the possibility that he wanted. After all, even if the future had countless possibilities, there were still only so many possibilities with high probabilities. Moreover, restraining the future still had to conform to basic logic. In this way, If he wanted to restrain the future according to a certain possibility, he only needed to consider the various possibilities that were in line with basic logic. The various possibilities that were in line with basic logic were clearly limited, but it was impossible for them to be truly infinite. In this way, as long as he modified it enough times, he would naturally be able to determine the possibility that he could restrain the future. And Luo Fan's clone could obviously modify the past and the choices that he had made countless times. In this way, was there any need to say anything else about the outcome? Previously, when Luo Fan experimented with his ability to change the past, the changes that he made were clearly targeted changes that he had made according to the countless possibilities that he had seen in the future. Through these changes, the endless world could reduce its losses in this tribulation as much as possible, so that after this tribulation, the endless world could retain more vitality. At this time, in the world constructed by the endless tribulation, the countless supreme transcendents were endlessly shocked by the new creatures that had appeared. These creatures seemed to have just appeared, but everyone felt that their appearance was so normal that they couldn't even find a reason for their sudden appearance in their memories. Now, these creatures had already rebuilt their civilization in this part of the world. Compared to the many supreme transcendents, the birth of this part of the world was naturally relatively short. A few decades was nothing compared to these supreme transcendents who had lived for billions of years. However, this was only relative to these people who had transcended the world. Compared to those ordinary living beings, and even to ordinary cultivators, this period of time was definitely quite considerable. This was especially so when they faced a brand new world. Even after these creatures entered this part of the world, they had also received a hint from the endless tribulation, telling them that they had to accept a test in order to escape and ensure that their world wouldn't be damaged. After all, at that time, the Supreme Transcendents had clearly told them not to choose their path so quickly, and to wait for them to clearly explore their path before making their choice. For those who had transcended all over the world, this kind of delayed choice was naturally nothing. They only needed to slightly suppress their impulses, and that would be enough. Chapter 32:02. However, it was clear that waiting for a few decades was not the same for those ordinary living beings. Some of those ordinary living beings did not even have any cultivation base or extraordinary traits. What they had was something that Luo Fan had bestowed upon them, something that was extraordinarily compatible with those paths. Apart from that, everything about them was essentially no different from ordinary living beings. In that case, if they wanted to survive, they would need all sorts of things to replenish their energy, just like ordinary living beings. For example, eating, drinking, defecating, clothing, food, shelter, and transportation. It was clear that in order to maintain the needs of a large number of living beings, they would need to be organized. Moreover, it was clear that these living beings had their own organizations. In the world where they were born, there were countries, civilizations, and all sorts of forces. Under such circumstances, after they entered this world, they did not even need to change much. They could directly form complete organizations to develop this world. This world was like the world where they were born, and it could maintain the survival of most of their members. In that case, it was easy to imagine the changes that would happen to this world. Although it had only been a few decades, the entire world seemed to be filled with traces of countless civilizations. The entire world seemed to have completely turned into an ordinary world where intelligent living beings were born. The barren world that was created by the endless heaven and earth tribulations to accommodate all those who had transcended had long disappeared without a trace. If new cultivators stepped into this world now, even if they knew how they had entered this world, they would probably doubt their own senses. After all, no matter how one looked at this world, it seemed like an ordinary world. It was not much different from the world that they had left. As for a civilization with countless members, it was impossible for there to be no changes in the members of a civilization that had existed for decades. For any civilization with potential, it was almost inevitable for the number of members to increase. After all, There were too many activities in a civilization that could increase the number of members. Therefore, after several decades, this civilization had a large number of members who were born and raised in this world. Compared to their fathers and grandfathers, these members had a special characteristic. They had fused with those paths to begin with. No matter how ordinary this world seemed, it was not ordinary at all. After all, it was a world that had been created by the endless heaven and earth tribulations to test all those who had transcended. In such a world, any living being only needed a thought to obtain the basic qualifications to set foot on a certain path. This was the case even if the qualifications were countless times higher than the original cultivation realm of that living being. In this way, the living beings that were born and raised in this world could not be like the living beings that were born in ordinary worlds. In an ordinary world, if a living being wanted to obtain power, even if it was in a world that was most compatible with supernatural powers, they would have to go through many dangers, surmount many difficulties, and go through many trials to achieve it. However, in this world, if they wanted to achieve this, they only needed a thought to obtain it. The great difference was self-evident. With such a difference, there would naturally be a huge difference in the way living beings grew. After the living beings that were born and raised in this world gained complete consciousness, they naturally knew how to suppress their desires and listen to their seniors' instructions, not stepping onto those paths. However, what about when they did not have complete consciousness? Clearly, when they did not have complete consciousness, they could not have such self-control. Therefore, it was naturally impossible for any living being born in this world to behave like their parents and ancestors and treat those paths as if they didn't exist. By the time they gained complete consciousness and knew how to suppress their impulses and desires, they would have already completed the entire process of coming into contact with those paths. However, this did not mean that the living beings that were born and raised in this world did not have the chance to grow. Those that had complete consciousness had the advantage of having complete consciousness. Those that did not have complete consciousness also had the advantage of not having complete consciousness. Those that had complete consciousness knew self-control and knew how to weigh the pros and cons. They would not easily choose to accept the test and step onto those paths. Those that did not have complete consciousness did not know self-control, did not know how to weigh the pros and cons, and did not know how to suppress their desires and impulses. Thus, they would choose to step onto those paths when things were messy. However, it was precisely because they did not have complete consciousness that they could not truly step onto those paths. Those paths were meant to test the ability of those who had transcended in this world to walk on those paths. Under such circumstances, only those who had the qualifications to move forward on those paths could truly accept the test and step onto those paths. If they did not even have complete consciousness and the ability to walk on those paths, how could they truly step onto those paths? Clearly, the living beings that were born and raised in this world would have a period of time where they had the initiative to choose but did not have the qualifications to step onto those paths. This, of course, formed a rather awkward situation for the test. That was, they had already obtained the benefits, but in the end, they did not have the qualifications to accept the test. It was as if they were already standing on the doorstep and taking a step out, but could not step into the door. They could only have 1 foot outside and 1 foot inside. Thus, this change resulted in the living beings that were born and raised in this world being fundamentally different from the living beings that were born and raised in other worlds. To a certain extent, they could already be counted as existences that were compatible with those paths. Essentially, each such living being could actually be counted as the embodiment of the beginning of a certain path. They had many characteristics that belonged to those paths, and this, combined with the special characteristics that Luo Fan had bestowed upon them, made them extremely compatible with those paths. As a result, although they did not accept the endless trials of the world's tribulations, they were actually exploring those trials in a different manner. In other words, they could be said to be constantly simulating the process of accepting the trials. Along with this change, the living beings that were born and raised in this world were as strong as the sky and the earth when compared to their fathers and ancestors. This huge difference caused the potential of this civilization to continuously rise with the passage of time. It could be predicted that in another few decades, they would be able to truly match up to the transcendence. After another few decades, the number of living beings that were born and raised in this world would probably reach an unimaginable level. And with the special characteristics of these living beings, they could already be considered stronger than the majority of the transcendents. Although they were weaker than the truly powerful transcendents, just the fact that they were stronger than the majority of the transcendents was already enough for them to match up to the other transcendents. At this time, the transcendents had clearly already discovered this famous peculiarity. He discovered the mysteries of the native-born creatures that had just been born in this civilization. How could we have overlooked them before? At this time, the transcendents all had similar doubts in their hearts. This was also because the transcendents themselves were quite extraordinary, which was why they could discover this. Because of their extraordinary nature, although they couldn't sense the changes in the past, they could still vaguely sense some kind of peculiar feeling from another timeline. Thus, they discovered this abnormality that should have been incomparably natural to them and shouldn't have been felt at all. However, it was clear that even the Sixth Tribulation experts couldn't clearly recognize that all of this was due to the changes in the past. Compared to the other transcendents, the Sixth Tribulation experts only felt that the abnormality was more intense. But as for the specifics, they didn't know at all. It was precisely because of this that such a situation had occurred. They have the special characteristics of those paths. In that case, we can consciously guide them. The transcendents already had their own conclusions. The living beings that were born and raised in this world naturally wouldn't choose a fixed path during the process of their unconscious growth. In the process of their growth, they would naturally choose a random path. In this case, this situation was clearly not enough to satisfy those who had transcended all over the world. After all, the transcendents had already opened up a certain path and confirmed that it was the correct path. Moreover, they had already sacrificed a lot for that path. Under such circumstances, they naturally couldn't completely change their way of thinking just because the living beings that were born and raised here had all sorts of conveniences. They wouldn't completely sever all of their previous sacrifices. Thus, completely copying their specialties and only accepting their specialties was clearly out of the question. Of course, this didn't mean that they couldn't think of anything else. Even in the mortal world, there was such a thing as prenatal education, let alone the transcendence. Compared to the prenatal education of the mortal world, the transcendence could do many more things, and the effects were more spectacular. Thus, before the living beings that were born and raised here truly matured and decided on a path, they could use certain methods to influence them and make them choose the path they wanted them to choose. This wasn't a difficult matter for the transcendents. And once they chose the correct path for the transcendents, it would obviously be a good thing for both the transcendents and the living beings that were born and raised here. For the transcendents, there was no need to say much. Every living being that was born and raised here was a type of simulation of that path. This would give them a chance to walk the path before they actually chose it. This was equivalent to taking out the test paper early and letting the examinees try it a few times, a few hundred times, a few thousand times, tens of thousands of times. It went without saying how great the benefits were for them. The situation was similar for the living beings that were born and raised here. After all, for the living beings that were born and raised here, choosing a path was equivalent to deciding their entire lives, deciding their own future. Under such circumstances, choosing the correct path that the transcendents had explored and opened up after sacrificing time and time again was obviously more perfect than choosing other paths with unknown futures. After all, there was a certain chance of success if one chose this path, but the future of the other paths was completely uncertain. Under such circumstances, the benefits of accepting the influence of the transcendents naturally didn't need to be mentioned. Along with this change, the attempts on the path that had been going on like a raging fire had come to a halt. Even the transcendents who had already set foot on the path and started sprinting on it stopped moving at this time. They began to divert some of their attention to participate in the prenatal education for the living beings that were born and raised here. After all, no matter how fast they were with the abilities of those who had transcended, even if they chose the correct path and truly walked that path, or if they were truly stuck at a certain point on that path, the amount of time needed would still be calculated in the tens of thousands of years, or even hundreds of thousands of years. In such a long time, diverting a few decades, or even a few centuries to deal with other matters was like blinking an eye while running. Clearly, such a situation didn't put any pressure on the Transcendents at all. That was why they could divert some of their attention to participate in the prenatal education at this time. Not to mention the fact that diverting some of their attention wouldn't affect them much. Even if it did affect them greatly, they would still do it without hesitation. After all, compared to the benefits they would obtain, the risks they would take were nothing. It was precisely because of these considerations that the atmosphere of the entire world changed so obviously. The focus of the Transcendents shifted from the path to the living beings that were born and raised here.